My son was a happy boy. He had just turned 10, he was the light of my entire life. I considered him to be a miracle child. You see, I had trouble getting pregnant. I went through 3 miscarriages. It was so devastating I thought about just giving up on having a child of my own and adopting. So, when I had my son, it was as if God had opened the gates of heaven and sent me a child himself. We named him Finn, after my grandfather. We spoiled him every chance we got. My husband and I had finally made our dream of having a little family come true. We both worked to make ends meet. I was an evening CNA at a local hospital. My husband worked in a factory just outside of town. One fateful summer night would change my life forever. I was running late for work. It was almost 5. I was supposed to be there at 4:30. I hugged Finn goodbye and packed my husband a quick kiss before bolting out the door. I started my nightly routine and was halfway through cleaning patients' rooms when I heard my phone ringing. I rolled my eyes. People knew my work hours and knew I wasn't supposed to be on the phone when working. So I ignored it. They kept calling. I sighed heavily and put my supplies up and headed to the washroom to take the call. Whatever it was, couldn't wait until my break at 9:30. I took out my phone and saw it was my husband. "Hello?" I said in an irritable voice. His panic immediately alarmed me. He was shouting and crying hysterically. My husband is not a hyper man. My husband is what the kids these days call chill. He's the type of guy who would allow our son to eat ice cream for dinner. His panic caused my panic. Is Finn okay? I snapped. Everything he'd said was a blur as the adrenaline rushed through my blood. "No, there's been an accident." He heaved. My heart stopped. "An accident," I repeated, the word repeating in my head like a broken record. "You need to come home," my husband said breathlessly. I ran out the hospital door, shouting an excuse to my supervisor as I jolted past her. My tears were coming down like the first rain in almost a decade. I could barely see as I sped through traffic lights and stop signs. I ignored the honking and angry shouts. I did not have time. I was surprised I didn't get pulled over. I pulled up in our driveway. We lived in a nice 2-story house. Shrubs and bushes were decorative features on the outside. The porch was friendly and welcoming with a mat and plenty of armchairs. The first sign that something was severely wrong was 2 cop cars and an ambulance. The flashing lights and sirens led behind our home. I slammed my car door shut and ran to the backyard. There, my husband was talking to 2 policemen. I quickly approached them. "Brady, what happened to Finn?" I said breathlessly. His eyes were bloodshot. He went outside while I was in the shower. I guess he got in the pond, and his voice trailed off. My eyes gazed towards the ambulance. 2 EMTs were lifting a small black bag. "No, Finn. I couldn't take this anymore." I pushed past my husband. "You give me my son," I shouted aimlessly. I was about to attack someone when I realized my husband had caught up to me and was restraining me. "No, let me see my son," I screamed angrily as the tears fell uncontrollably. The rest of the evening was a blur. I passed out in my husband's arms. The next few days were the most miserable of my life. My son was gone and I couldn't believe it. I had hugged him hours before. I had made him lunch that day. I had cut his grilled cheese into 4 squares, just as he always liked it. I sat in our bedroom, staring at the wall, mindlessly. Our son was to be cremated. That was the family tradition. It felt wrong. 10 years old. He was supposed to bury me. I wasn't supposed to bury him. I turned my head slowly as my husband entered our room. Neither of us had slept or eaten or even showered. He was on the phone. His hair was greasy and messy. His voice was practically gone from crying so much. What do you mean you think somebody stole my son's body? He hissed into the receiver. I gaped at him. What? Who would do that? How would they do that? He stared at me in horror. He put the woman on speaker. It sounded just as exhausted and flabbergasted, but I did not care. This was her job. I'm terribly sorry, sir. We've searched everywhere, and he's just gone. We think that someone may have broken in last night. Did your son have any enemies? She questioned. He was a 10-year-old child, I said coldly as I grabbed the phone from my husband and hung up. I felt sickened. What did they mean they had lost Finn? How? The police will be stopping by later, my husband said later that day as we sat in silence at the kitchen table. I had a cup of cold, black coffee I was staring at. I nodded slightly to show him I was listening. He sighed. Honey, maybe we should talk, he began wearily. I cut him off with a sharp glance. Don't, was all I could muster. He sighed again, and left the kitchen. I was about to go back to the bedroom, when I heard the doorbell ring. I knew it must have been the police. I decided to let my husband deal with them. After a few moments, I heard my husband's voice. Honey, come in here, please, he said. His voice was unusually anxious and fearful. I rolled my eyes. I was too drained. I didn't want to go over this with the police. I didn't want to keep reliving this. I was in denial. My life had gone from perfect to a nightmare. I stomped into the kitchen, ready to tell the police off. What I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. Standing in the kitchen was my son. His pale blue eyes were no longer blue. They were jet black. His peachy skin was pale and scaly. His hair was matted and wet. His clothes were soaking and covered in moss and algae. I gaped at him in horror. I didn't understand. The smell was putrid, decaying flesh. I wrinkled my nose and willed myself to not be ill. Finn, I stuttered. What I thought was my son smiled, wide. No, he said. When the officer asked me how long she'd been missing, I swallowed the lump of nerves in my throat and said, 30 hours. He started to write the number down, then stopped. It took you 30 hours to realize your daughter was missing. I shook my head. I noticed she was missing when I woke up yesterday morning, but I know you have to wait 24 hours to file a missing persons report. Ma'am, that's a lie. It's vitally important that you report these incidents as soon as possible, okay? Every hour that passes makes it that much less likely we'll ever find your daughter. Anxiety clawed from my stomach back into my throat, prompting me to swallow again. Tears nipped at the corner of my eyes. My hands wrung themselves into a knot. All the warmth in my body slipped away. I didn't know that. He gave me a hard, scrutinizing look, then chalked me up as one more victim of poorly written crime shows, and asked some other questions. Ever since she was born premature, Mary had been a constant source of worrying for me. She developed too slowly, had difficulty with object permanence. Found balancing nearly impossible. Her physical problems ironed themselves out with the help of frequent trips to the pediatrician's office, making her relatively normal by the age of 2, but new problems cropped up. She liked to pull hair, strings, chains, anything that appeared to be connected to something, especially important or sensitive things. She liked to lie. If I asked her why she kept pulling the dog's tail, she'd throw her hands up, or hand, if one was busy holding the tail, and say, "No, I not." Timeouts didn't work. Scoldings didn't work. Holding her close, explaining what was wrong, taking away toys, none of that worked. My father took her upstate for a weekend and came back with a bite mark on his hand, admitting to spanking her. Not for the bite, which had come after the spanking, but for talking back. Somewhere, somehow, she'd learned the words asshole and die, even though I thought I'd done my best to minimize exposure to coarse language. Finally, I thought I'd found a method that worked. I told her to take a walk around the house after she broke her glass on purpose, saying to think about what she did, and for whatever reason she decided to obey. She walked from the kitchen to her bedroom to the living room to the kitchen again, over and over until she started to sniffle. I stopped her around the 6th lap and offered to put on cartoons. Her casual, though not abnormal, cruelty lessened after that. Only a little, but it was noticeable progress, and that was enough to calm her father and me down. Then, when she'd smacked her brother 5-year-old Peter so hard he cried, she took a walk around the perimeter of the house without being asked. Within seconds, I was on her tail, red in the face, ready to lock her in her room for the next 15 years out of an irrational parental panic. She stopped when my shadow overtook hers, and I started talking. She wasn't listening to me, though. She noticed a bird's nest tucked near a vent, 3 peeping bodies waiting for their mother. I didn't figure out what they were until she popped one's head off between her little sausage fingers. I gave her a bath, while her father made calls, trying to get an appointment with a child psychologist. I told her what she did was very, very bad, and she needed to be nicer to animals, especially itty-bitty ones. How would you like it if someone tried to hurt you? I said, a thin film of discipline over the well of disgust inside me. She shrugged. Mary enjoyed shrugging, staring right at you with big empty eyes. Those next months blurred into years, my husband, Peter, and I all struggling against the chaos that was Mary. Her new therapist explained violence was somewhat normal at this age, but a resistance towards healthy discipline wasn't. She was tested for all kinds of disorders, ranging from ADHD to PTSD to reactive attachment disorder, and while her results never came up looking like a normal child's, they were never conclusive as to what was going on in her mind. Soon the questions were pointed at my husband and I, then at Peter in case we were lying. We found a psychiatrist willing to prescribe psychiatric medication to a 4-year-old. The only substance with any effect was Adderall, which made her ability to hunt for bird nests a little more efficient. We then found a less trustworthy psychiatrist willing to prescribe tranquilizers to a 5-year-old. We hoped that if she could just calm down a little bit, we could get something through to her, or at least go a day without seeing blood on her face. Then, 2 days ago, she menaced Peter with a pair of scissors she'd stolen from her teacher's desk. The first graders weren't allowed to have normal scissors. She didn't draw blood, didn't even make contact with his skin, but it was too much. I asked her why she'd do that, and she shrugged, looking at me with her empty brown eyes. It was like she wasn't even human. I told her to go take a long walk. The officer ended his line of questioning after some amount of time I couldn't guess. My mind was spinning, exhausted and terrified, yet secretly, quietly, relieved. "We'll do everything we can, ma'am." "Thank you," I mumbled, and left the station in a daze, barely managing to open the passenger side door and take a seat next to my husband. "Do they need to talk to me? They have your number?" He said they'll call if they need to. We drove home, silent. There was nothing else to say. It's possible that I didn't try hard enough as a mother, that I was neglectful, and had somehow allowed some more nefarious abuse to slip into her life. The mere fact that my father thought it was okay to spank her was good evidence she may have been reacting to something happening I didn't know about. But if that were the case, it was something she refused to say even to her therapists, her brother, her aunts and uncles. There was no amount of questioning people felt was too much when dealing with her, and she answered every question, sometimes with lies, sometimes with uncomfortable honesty. Nothing to indicate trauma aside from her behavior. And honestly, I loved Mary. I had gone through so much pain and suffering, put my husband and son through that same suffering, all while clinging to the smallest hope that someday she could be healthy and happy and friendly. I would have let her kill the dog if it had meant she'd learn what it meant to hurt someone. Peter, however, was on track to become a wonderful person in spite of his sister, and at that moment she seemed to choose him as a sacrifice. While she walked, I came up with a plan. I told my husband, and we cried in each other's arms, out of mourning and relief. I told my husband, and we cried in each other's arms, out of mourning and relief. That what we'd never been able to admit to each other was finally in the open. Neither of us had the strength to hurt her directly. While she slept, we put her inside of a sleeping bag, drove to a secluded riverbank, and took deep shuddering breaths, as we heaved it back and forth in our arms. Of course, this decision has its own drawbacks. I'll never be able to stop thinking about what I'd done wrong, how I could have stopped this. How I let myself consider hurting my own flesh and blood. Peter will grow up having to wonder if his own parents are capable of the most heinous act, and he might be subjected to a complete media circus if they find evidence against us. And now, as I type this at night, I'm coming to believe in vengeful spirits. I don't know how else to explain the sound of a little fist knocking on the door. The front door tore open as the first rumblings of thunder burst through the early evening air. I could barely say hello before my mom threw an arm around my shoulders and tugged me inside. Bert, Hallie's finally home. I laughed as she pulled my bag from my hand and started fussing over me, brushing my hair back, squeezing my cheeks together. It was a habit I'd always hoped she'd grow out of as I reached adolescence. But after 7 long months away, I had to admit that it made me feel right back at home. Mom, stop, I'm fine, I insisted half-heartedly. You're late. She stuck one of those fingers right in my face and wagged it around. Dinner's been done for half an hour. Her eyes flickered to the front window, where the first droplets of rain had begun to spit from the sky. And it's about to storm. Of course it is. I shook my head and chuckled. It was a running joke in our family at this point. Every year on my birthday it rained. Without fail. For as long as I can remember, birthdays were marked by gathering around our dining room table, eating cake and opening presents, all while watching the world drown from out the side window. Thankfully, birthdays were always family events. There was always time for friends, my parents told me, but I only had so much time left to spend with them. Let me put my stuff away. I'll be down in a second, I said, starting up the stairs. With each step my head throbbed like an overinflated balloon. My early birthday celebration the night before had been a success, but the hangover left in its wake was particularly wicked. My bedroom sat at the end of the hall, untouched since I'd left for college in the fall. It was a strange little time capsule of old friends and faded memories that by now felt like another lifetime. I smiled and tossed my backpack on the bed. Something delicious tickled at my nose as I made my way back downstairs and headed toward the dining room. My mom's famous jambalaya was another birthday tradition. It sounded like the perfect thing to settle my stomach and my nerves. My dad was already seated at the head of the table, a tumbler of scotch in hand that he raised in a toast as I rounded the corner. And there she is, he boomed, his thick brown mustache bobbing over his lips for dramatic effect. The prodigal daughter returns. Oh, shut up. I laughed and headed over for a quick hug. Soon enough we settled in and all had an overflowing plate in front of us. They wasted no time before falling back into their familiar routine of grilling me on just about every subject they could think of. Grades, friends, my new part-time job. My parents have always been involved, to say the least. It was another one of those things I'd only been able to start appreciating with time. How's that dorm life? My dad asked as my mom hopped up to start scooping dessert. That roommate of yours still stealing your clothes? That's actually something I wanted to talk to you guys about. My stomach sank to the floor and blood rushed my cheeks. What's that? Asked my mom. Well, you guys know I had such bad luck this year with her. It really interrupted my studies, I stressed. You didn't tell us that. Well, it did. So that's why me and Brian decided next semester that we're going to move in together. The silence that fell was bitterly cold. It froze both of my parents in place, mouth agape, waiting for me to say the punchline. Seconds ticked by before, all at once, they exploded back to life. Like hell you are, said my dad. You've got to be kidding me, said my mom. Dad, you're 19 years old, Hallie. You're way too young to be shacking up with some loser. Dad, I'm an adult. You can't just are you adult enough to pay for school on your own? We went back and forth for a while, voices steadily rising as the cherry pie on our plates got cold and thunder shook the windows. I'd known they wouldn't approve, but this was worse than I'd ever imagined. Mom stayed quiet, caught between us like a hostage negotiator, begging with her eyes for us to calm down. Go ahead then. I shot up from my chair, sending it crashing to the floor behind me, as I slammed my hand on the polished tabletop. Cut me off. I'll drop out and wait tables the rest of my life. Either way, I'm moving in with him. End of story. Hallie, you sit your ass down. His shouting grew distant as I turned and stormed back down the hall and up the stairs, eventually slamming my bedroom door behind me. It was juvenile, perhaps, but it still felt good to make the frame quake behind me as I took to pacing the room. Frustration bubbled under my skin like a shaken soda bottle, ready to burst. How many fights had ended this very same way? How many times had my parents put their foot down when I tried to establish the barest hint of independence? Too many to count. I was sure Mom was rubbing Dad's back by then, assuring him I'd come to my senses. He wouldn't apologize. He never did. Instead, he'd wait for me to sulk back with my tail between my legs, ready to apologize and give in to whatever he decided was right for me. Fuck that. I slung my backpack back over my shoulder and grabbed my keys. I'd drive 15 more hours, if it meant I didn't have to look at his smug face waiting for me to cow. I heard their voices muttering from the dining room as I swung the front door open. The mossy smell of fresh rain hit me like a brick, while the chilled breeze washed down my lungs like a glass of ice water. Hallie, my mother screamed from the other room. Pulling the hood of my jacket snugly over my head, I darted off the porch. A wave of pain exploded in my body, so intense my vision went black for a moment, so consuming I couldn't tell right away where it had come from. Before I knew it, I was being lurched backward by something wrapped tightly around my neck. I hit the porch with a thud. The pressure eased. My mother knelt over me, eyes white as dinner plates. "Oh God," she whispered. The pain. It was still there, burning, spreading. It prickled along my cheek and my hands. I moaned, a low and keening noise that I almost didn't recognize as my own. And then I lifted my hand up in front of my face. A sob tore from my lips as I caught sight of it. It was like acid had been splashed across my skin. Gelatinous clumps of flesh had melted away, dripping down to my wrist and coagulating on the sleeve of my hoodie. It was still going, a bubbling liquid eating away everything in its path. Even worse was what lay underneath it. Instead of the pearly white bones I might expect jutting out from the mess of ruined flesh, something else sat there instead. There were fingers, sure. My fingers, given how they clenched and moved in turn with the waves of pain that coursed through me. But they were as black as the night around us, made of hundreds of delicate, intertwining bones that reminded me of birds' legs. They joined at the top into a vicious point. A scream bubbled up in the back of my throat, trapped there as tear-streaked eyes darted to my mother's worried face. She barely glanced at my misshapen hand, but did reach down to give my covered shoulder a comforting squeeze. Her eyes turned to find my father shaking in the doorway. "Bert," she gasped, raising her free hand to cover her trembling lips. "They're going to find her." My dad sprung into action, our argument from moments before a long-forgotten memory. His arms under my shoulders and dragged me back inside. I hung limp like a ragdoll, tears finally breaking through the barrier of shock and disorientation that had held them at bay. My mother slammed the door shut behind us, clicking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. "I'll get the bags," she announced. My father gave one quick grim nod. "I'll get the car ready." "What's happening?" I groaned from the floor, cradling my ruined hand in the other. Some patches of flesh had burned away on it as well, but altogether it was in much better shape. It still looked like mine. It still looked human. I could even still see the scar from 7th grade where Preston had stabbed me with a pencil. "Don't have time, sweetie," he said. "We have to move." He disappeared down the hallway, and I heard the door to the garage crash open. I was left alone to hiccup and cry on the foyer floor, until I'd finally calmed enough to pull my unsteady feet back underneath me. My face still burned. I staggered into the living room, where an oversized ornate mirror hung behind the couch. Everything in my body screamed that this was a horrible idea, that I didn't want to know. But I had to see, I just had to. Even still, I gasped. Spots of disintegration were speckled across my face. The tip of my nose was gone, my left cheek was hollowed out like a pumpkin. Underneath sat those same spindly, paper-thin bones. Millions of them. In the overhead light they had an eerie, incandescent glow. But wait, were they moving? Thunder ripped through the sky outside. My body shook right along with the frame of the house. Realization struck just as lightning lit the front yard. No, that made no sense. I'd been out in the rain plenty of times in my life. I'd walked home in it after school. Came home drenched one night, after sneaking out with my friends. In fact, I was quite fond of the rain, despite the fact that it always seemed to unsettle my mom. It made no sense. Another crashing sound thudded through the house, almost mistaken for another round of thunder. The storm was right on top of us now, roaring and dripping all around. But no clap of lightning followed. Seconds later. Bang. I jumped back, glancing toward the ceiling. Upstairs my mother raced back and forth, doors squeaked open and closed. But no, that wasn't it. "Dad," I called in a hushed tone down the hall. There wasn't an answer. I couldn't hear him past the hum of this storm. Movement caught my eye in the mirror. I searched for it once, twice. Nothing. The car drove by on the street outside, headlights cutting through the inky darkness of the street. There, palms outstretched on the front window, stood a massive shadow. I spun around. The light quickly flickered away, bathing it once more in darkness, but now that my eyes had found it, I couldn't possibly look away. It wasn't a shadow at all, just a mess of dark, delicate bones. Its eyes glinted beyond the glass, a deep, intoxicating violet. As it watched me, something on its face stretched wide. More darkness lingered in its open mouth, but I could tell it was smiling. I screamed, all the horror that had welled up inside me reaching a shrill, piercing crescendo. My father barreled around the corner, but jerked to a stop when he saw the creature out the window. Its long, spindly fingers curled into a fist and beat against the glass. "She's ours," my father shouted. "Leave us alone." He wrapped an arm around my waist and pulled me back into the foyer. My mother was just ascending the stairs, bags in hand. The glass above the front window exploded inward, showering us with crystalline shards. All three of us darted for the back door. Adrenaline dulled the pain in my hand to a distant ache. My parents' SUV was already running, the backseat piled high with totes and bags previously tucked away in the garage. I'd never asked what my dad had kept stored out there, why the garage was the only room in the house perpetually cluttered. I hopped in the back seat while my parents climbed in the front. I huffed as my father adjusted the rear view. I could see his veins bulging in his arm, my mom's tear-stricken face glancing behind us. "Now, Bert." Her tone was solemn, resigned. My father clicked the garage door opener and shifted into reverse. The door hummed, and then kicked to life, groaning as it inched up off the ground. The sound of rain still dancing along the roof above us. I turned in my seat to stare out the back window. We all held our breath. The door was about 3 feet high, when the first dark figure wrapped its hands around its base and shoved upwards. Metal squealed against metal as it was pushed further up into the ceiling. My hands darted to my ears, and then I caught sight of my own, blackened fingers, and they fell back down to my side. Another figure darted in, skittering against the cement, jumping up to rest on our bumper. Behind it was a third, this one more cautious, peeking in under the door and smiling its predatory grin. "Now," my mom shouted. My dad slammed on the gas and the Ford flew backward. The door hadn't fully ascended. The two creatures still back there jumped to either side. The roof of the vehicle scraped the aluminum door, sticking for a few long, painful seconds before we burst free into the night air. The last creature clung on for dear life, hands digging into the side of the vehicle, feet slipping against the now slick bumper. Its black teeth gnashed against the glass. Its purple eyes were wide, hysterical. It looked pained, terrified, sad. My dad hardly slowed as we pulled out onto the street and kicked it in drive, even as the tires screamed underneath us. As we lurched forward, it struggled against the vehicle, eventually losing its grip and tumbling away. I watched it hit the wet cement behind us with a thud. The others weren't far behind. Both stopped to pull it back up to its feet. We ripped through our quiet suburban neighborhood, twisting and turning until we reached the exit for the highway. The creatures faded behind us, yet still I found myself staring out into the pouring rain, hands stinging in my lap. Finally, I was pulled from my daze by the jarring flash of headlights behind us. I turned back around to my parents. Finally, I was pulled from my daze by the jarring flash of headlights behind us. I turned back around to my parents. "Mom," I said. "Dad, what's going on?" They exchanged a long glance. My mom shook as she reached out to turn down the radio. I hadn't even noticed it humming in the background. "We should have told you, Hallie," she whispered, shaking her head. "We were foolish to think we were foolish to wait so long." I stared down at my torn hand, the same delicate alien black bones of the creatures that had attacked us. Was I? "You shouldn't have tried to leave, sweetie," added my dad. I'd never heard him sound so small, so helpless. The disappointment in his tone was nothing like his rage-fueled rants of disapproval, but something far more visceral. "Now I don't know if we can protect you." "Don't say that," my mother snapped. I leaned back into the plush gray seat, exhaustion sinking me down into the headrest. I caught a glance of myself in the review. My burned, speckled face looked pale, sickly. The blue of my eyes looked darker, deeper. "Protect me from what?" I asked. A sob shook my mother's chest. She turned toward the window and buried her face in her hands. My dad's eyes rose to meet my own in the mirror, brows hanging over them like thick branches bowing in the wind. Something deep in my gut already knew the answer, but even still I needed to hear him say it. I needed to know. We drove for hours in silence, my father staring solemnly out into the road. My mother, sniffling and hiccuping next to him. After the adrenaline of our escape wore off, I curled up in the back row of seats and did my best to let my mind drift off into a welcome oblivion. The sting in my hand had worn off several miles out of town. When I realized the pain was gone, I'd lifted it to my face to inspect it further. My human fingertips brushed against the melted skin, and it flaked away underneath like a bad sunburn. I grabbed a bit of it and tugged. It pulled away in a long, gooey string that stuck to the seat underneath me. "Don't do that," my mother snapped. I hadn't even noticed her looking. It all started shortly after they were married. My father had said, back when they'd just begun to dream of the wonderful little family they would have together. "I've heard this story 1,000 times, I told him, huffing in frustration. "You and Mom wanted a dozen kids, at least. But no matter what, it never seemed to happen. You nearly gave up, but the week after Mom's doctor told you it was hopeless, she got pregnant with me." "No," he'd said. "We never told you she got pregnant." I quieted down and let him continue. "We tried everything at that point. Doctors, of course, but more than that. Faith healers, shamans, wishing on shooting fucking stars. It seemed like every culture around the world had their little spells and charms to help with fertility, but at the end of the day most of them were full of shit. Until one wasn't," my mom whispered. "It was the strangest thing. Back before we moved here we lived in this tiny little town called St. James. Down the block from our apartment was a widow. Mrs. Danby. She was a strange woman, kept to herself. Every single window to her house was covered in blackout curtains. I only ever saw her sitting on her porch when I left for the hospital before the sun rose, or got home in the wee hours of the morning. She always waved, but she never said hello." "We never told her anything," my mom interjected. "Like he said, we never talked to her. I hadn't told her about my issues with getting pregnant. I hadn't told anyone, not even Grandma and Grandpa. I just felt so useless." "Margaret." My dad's voice softened. He reached out to squeeze her leg. "You didn't do anything wrong." But one day, she continued, the old woman showed up at the door. Dad was at work, and the sun was still high in the sky. In her arms was a dark purple blanket wrapped in a tight bundle. Whatever was inside was moving, squirming. I swallowed down the lump expanding in my throat. "It was me?" I asked. She let out a long, shaking breath. "Yes, it was you." Road signs had flickered past the windows at that point, announcing our departure from town. Rain continued to beat heavily against the windows, blown from wind almost as chilly as the silence between us. My mother cleared her throat and continued. She said she'd known of our struggles, how badly we wanted a family. That while she couldn't make our dreams come true, she could give us one. Just one. A child of our own. I was terrified. I thought she'd gone off her rocker for good. I thought she'd kidnapped a baby or something. But I was sort of mesmerized by her too. I looked down at the bundle, and even though I couldn't see anything inside, I could just feel it, you know. That child, that you, were ours. "I don't understand," I said, only for my father to snap back at me. "Just let your mother finish." I invited her inside, she continued, and she locked the door behind her. She ushered me back into the bedroom like she'd been there before, like she knew exactly where it was. She told me to keep quiet, to listen, or for as long as I lived I'd never hear the laughter of a child. I didn't even question it. I just believed her. She pulled back the blanket and she wavered, gripping hard at the center console. I didn't know what I was seeing. It was tiny and black as coal. I thought it was something dead, and then it started to coo. She set it down on the bed, and it stretched its little arms, wiggled its toes. Despite how strange it looked, it was clearly a baby. She took my hand in hers, squeezed it like a vice. It was ours now, she told me. Ours forever. As long as we protected it. As long as we loved it. I promised her we would. That it was all I ever wanted. When I looked back, its black little bones were gone, covered in soft pale flesh, red round cheeks. "We do love you," my father added. Guilt swam in his voice like a koi fish. "You know that, right?" She squeezed my hand tighter until I looked back over at her. Tears were streaming down my face at that point, but her eyes were hard as steel. She leaned in close. Her breath smelled like menthol and incense. There was one rule we couldn't break if we truly wanted this child to be ours, she said. Once a year on the anniversary of that day, it would rain. It would rain all day and all night, until the ground flooded and trees fell, and no matter what, we could never let that particular rain touch her skin. If we did, the illusion would be gone. And the creatures that she came from, my father finished, would find her. A million questions filled my head, but as soon as each occurred they drifted back out like a wave receding from the shore. It was too much for my mind to grasp. Somewhere along the line, exhaustion took me, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. Sometime later I started back awake only to find the air filled with my mother's soft snores. My dad still stared vigilantly ahead of us. I couldn't recognize where we were. As I searched the dark night for a clue, I swore I could see shadows flickering along the tree line in the distance. "Dad," I muttered, pushing myself up from the seat with my skeletal hand. The pain had all but vanished. It felt stronger somehow, vibrant. Like a current of energy zipped up and down the length of my fingers. "Where are we going?" For a moment I wasn't sure he would answer me, too lost in his own grim thoughts and the all-encompassing darkness ahead. Finally, he sighed, glancing back at me through the review mirror. "We're going to St. James, Hallie. We're going to get some answers." The town sat several miles off of the highway, a small decrepit place one could easily pass through without realizing it even existed. The gas station on its outskirts was the only lit building I saw. Otherwise, the dim glow of street lamps in the distance looked more like dying stars hanging close to earth, ready to fall. My mom started awake as we pulled to a stop. In a flash she'd taken in our surroundings and I could see the apprehension well up in her puffy cheeks. "Are you sure she's still here, Bert?" My father snorted. "Where else would the old hag go?" I stayed quiet in the backseat, ducked down with my hood pulled tightly around my head. I couldn't imagine how the woman was still alive, if she'd already been old when I was a baby. My father seemed confident though. What room did I have to argue? My mom darted off to use the restroom, and outside the opposite door my dad fiddled with the gas cap. The storm had finally calmed into a half-hearted drizzle around us, bathing the cement in a glossy, dazzling sheen. They knew I was close, that I was coming home. They didn't have to search for me any longer. Soon my parents packed back into the car. Even from behind them, I could practically feel them buzzing with trepidation, feel the hair on the back of their arms rising from the chill of the air. Large round drops of water pooled on their raincoats, so close I could reach out and touch it. The car jerked into motion and we pulled back onto the road. The town ahead inched closer as my dad stepped on the gas. For most of the trip I'd been tired and dazed in the backseat, but now I sat ramrod straight, attention held raptly by those lights in the distance. The tingling in my veins turned into a full-on itch. It was all I could do to keep it at bay. Out of nowhere I lurched forward, forehead colliding with the back of the driver's seat, before the suddenly tightened seatbelt made me gag from its pressure. I lifted both hands up to protect my face, to try in vain to push myself back up. The car was spinning, I realized, skating on the wet cement as if it were a roller rink, the tail end skidding to the left. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," my mother chanted like a prayer. And then the impact hit, and quieted all of us. Seconds crawled by like ants through molasses. I raised my clawed hand to my head and retracted it to find fresh flowing blood. The window next to me was cracked, one large round point of impact that spiderwebbed out in delicate patterns throughout the entirety of the pane. To my right the car was crumpled like an old candy wrapper, folded around a massive tree trunk. My mother was groaning, pawing at her right elbow. My father was slumped down in his seat. I leaned forward to peer over the center console. The headlights still illuminated the murky night ahead. Four lanky shadow figures stood vacantly in the distance, their bodies swaying and pulsing with unspent energy. Bang. I jumped as something collided with my side of the car. A hand, I realize, pounding against the glass of my father's window. A hand that was black as night, composed of delicate, spindly bones and a 19-year vendetta. Something landed on top of the car, and another hand pounded against the windshield. Neither of my parents had come to yet. My mind raced, trying to remember where my father had stashed the gun, turning over the possibility of us getting the car moving again even if we tried. Every train of thought only led back to one cold, hard reality. I couldn't protect them. Not here. Not like this. In the distance, the others began to approach. I snatched my hoodie back over my head, and pulled the strings to tighten it as far as it would go. My hand wrapped around the door handle. In front of me, small pieces of glass chipped away from the rest of the pane on the driver's window, and flew toward my father's face. I took a deep, slow breath to steady myself. And then I shoved my door open. In seconds I was darting away, wincing as the dripping rain met my skin, and sent short sizzles of pain searing through me. I shoved my hands in my pockets, which threw me off balance, but at least kept the worst of it at bay as I made it 1 yard away. And then 2. On the road there were more of them. One was collapsed on the ground, its long skeletal leg jutting off at a severe sort of angle, with 2 more trying to pull it to his feet. From behind me, a screech filled the air, alerting the others to my presence. I swerved to avoid them and headed for the trees in the distance. I let out a pained cry as I broke through the forest line. My clothes were growing heavy with the weight of the water soaking into them, shaken off of the overhanging leaves. As it pressed against my skin, the brief bursts of pain turned into a full-on blaze. It was as if boiling water or acid had seeped into my hoodie and jeans, and clung like static against my skin. The pain quickly got the better of me, leaving me staggering, jerking my hands out of my pockets just in time to brace against a tree as I started to lose my balance. Its bark bit at my hands, rubbing away the delicate false skin that clung to it. My vision swayed, nausea bubbling in my stomach like a fizzy drink. I clawed desperately at the base of my jacket and the tank top underneath. Anything to make the burning stop. I pulled them up and over my head, crying as my skin clung to them, sloughing off my bones like a layer of dried glue. I glanced down at my body. I couldn't help it. Somehow I still expected to see red, pulsing organs, pearly white ribs. But there was nothing of the sort. Only midnight dark bones, hard and protective like an exoskeleton. I glanced down at my body. I couldn't help it. Somehow I still expected to see red, pulsing organs, pearly white ribs. But there was nothing of the sort. Only midnight dark bones, hard and protective like an exoskeleton. I fumbled next with my jeans, hands shaking in anticipation of the pain that would follow. Already the searing sensation from my torso had turned into a dull ache that I longed for across the rest of my body, skin be damned. Everything around me tilted and shivered, but as I kicked off my shoes and shoved the denim down over my ankles, movement from up ahead caught my eye. I stumbled out of my pants and fell backward, hitting the wet grass with a thud. Up ahead of me was one of them, standing regally against the trees. Another emerged from the shadows, and then another. I twisted to look behind me. 3 more were already there. "Don't hurt them," I begged. My own voice was unfamiliar to me, filled with gravel. "Please, don't hurt them. I'll do anything, Why would we hurt them, dear?" A voice spoke from somewhere ahead of me. I looked back and forth between the creatures, trying to make sense of where those sweet matronly words had originated from. From behind one of the trees another figure appeared, short and stooped, shuffling carefully over the uneven ground. Her gray hair stood out like a beacon in the dark night, yet the trees above cast ghastly shadows into the deep-set wrinkles of her face. Her grin was sinister, yet nothing else in her posture suggested a threat. The creatures, my family, parted to let her through. "All they want is for you to come home." One of the creatures approached me. It was slow, hesitant in its movements. It reached a tentative hand out to brush against my cheek. I flinched, but forced my gaze up regardless to meet its violet eyes. I could swear I saw tears welling up in the corners. Two others moved forward, offering their hands to help me to my feet. Together, we stumbled after Miss Danby as she turned and headed deeper into the forest. Behind me, the injured creature was helped along by the others, and we kept a slow, steady pace with one another. Two others moved forward, offering their hands to help me to my feet. Together, we stumbled after Miss Danby as she turned and headed deeper into the forest. Behind me, the injured creature was helped along by the others, and we kept a slow, steady pace with one another. In the distance, I could hear my father screaming my name. The forest was deeper and darker than I would have imagined, growing thick around me with each treacherous step. My feet caught in the underbrush. But for every trip and stumble, the creatures stood patiently by my side as I recovered. Up ahead of us, Miss Danby moved through the trees with startling ease despite her advanced age. Her and her companions nearly blended in with the wilderness, an extension of the gnarled bark and twisting branches around us. The thought comforted me, and then instantly filled me with unease as I realized how preposterous that was. Family or not, I didn't belong here. The farther we went, the more I had to keep reminding myself. I'm not sure how long or how far we walked before the old witch finally came to a stop. I could barely make out a line of stones on the ground before her, jutting off in either direction and disappearing into the thick foliage. I blinked, and then squinted against the darkness. They hadn't just tucked themselves away in the shadows. They disappeared entirely, as if the forest itself had sucked them back in. My gaze dropped back down to the stones for a moment, before rising to see Miss Danby's grinning face. I found them by accident, she explained, gesturing toward the towering trees behind her. Many years ago, I lost my husband and daughter in a car crash. Overnight, I was left all alone. I took to wandering the forest. I'd walk for hours on end, listening to the wind and the birds, imagining I heard their voices whispering just under the surface. I was probably mad with grief, but it was like I knew if I just kept walking, I might find them again. But you didn't, I said, taking a step closer to her. I understood the pull my mother felt to this strange, mesmerizing woman. Even though she spoke in a hushed, intimate volume, each word seemed polished, grand, rolling off her tongue with a conspiratory flourish. Of course not, she huffed. They were dead. It was her turn to move forward, floating past me to stop in front of the towering monster to my right. The one who'd brushed my cheek looked at me with so much longing that it made my stomach twist. The old woman smiled at it and reached out to clutch its hand, giving it a small, loving squeeze. But I did find them. What are they? Finally, I felt something stirring within me, a hint of the dismay that I should have been feeling all along. You mean, she corrected, dropping the creature's hand to point a finger in my direction. What are you? My gaze dropped to the front of my body, the twisted black bones that had been hiding just below the surface. There were still spots of flesh speckled along my legs and torso, but even that was starting to curl around the edges and flake away. Soon, there'd be none left at all. They don't have a name, she continued. At least not one that humans would understand. They're simply a part of the forest, a part of nature. They always have been. They live here, tucked away safely behind their barrier. The stones, I realize, they kept them hidden from the world. They can't leave unless it's raining, I said, voice breathless. Miss Danby nodded, pleased with my assessment. No, they cannot. That twisting feeling in my stomach became a full-on lurch, visions of my life at home flashing before my eyes as if on a projector screen. My dorm room, messy and cramped, but filled with laughter and all-nighters. A year's worth of independence. Brian, with his boyish smile and crooked front tooth. On our third date he'd asked before he kissed me and brushed the hair out of my face. Mom and Dad, all of our many battles contrasting against how fiercely they loved me, how proud they were of every accomplishment. I can't leave, I continued. Not once I'm past the stones. Her grin faltered, though I suspected that was only for my benefit. Despite her compelling performance, empathy wasn't a look that she wore well. "No," she confirmed. "You cannot." "Why?" I snapped, stumbling backward, away from them. The two creatures left moved toward me, tension rippling through their taut bodies. "Why do I have to go back?" "It's your home," she answered calmly, despite the hint of hysteria escalating in my voice. "It's where you belong." "Then why did you take me away? Why did you give me to my parents in the first place?" She sighed, a wrinkled hand raising to rest on one of their shoulders. "They're a powerful species. I'm sure you've seen evidence of that. Unlike any other being on this earth. Unfortunately, they're ill-equipped to take care of their young. In the past they lived alongside humans. They had an understanding with the local tribes in the area. The humans raised their young, and they offered them protection. When I found them, there were only a handful left. You tricked my parents. You preyed on their desire for a child. That's sick." My heart quivered like a rabbit in my chest. The creature sensed my panic. One opened its mouth and let out a garbled roar. It seemed pleading, pained. Pity cooled the rising tide of my anger. At least until Miss Danby opened her mouth again. "Normally, they can't keep them out of the rain so long. Your human family did an admirable job with you." My fists curled at my side. I could feel the newfound power that resided within them. It pulsed, begging to be released. I imagined grabbing the old widow by the collar, darting off into the trees, sinking my teeth into her skin. The noises of the forest came to an unsettling halt as the sound echoed off the tall trees surrounding us. I looked between the creatures in confusion, before my gaze fell on Miss Danby. Her eyes were wide, panicked. Looking down, a gaping hole in her chest leaked blood down her torso. Behind her, my father trained his gun on one of the monsters. In a flash they turned to him, screeching. One pounced, pinning him to the ground. The other knelt beside Miss Danby, warbling as it tried to cover her wound. The shock rooted me in place, at least until another of them emerged from the stone barrier. And then another. They darted off to join the battle. "Dad!" He screamed as claws dug into his shoulder, sinking through like warm butter. In a flash the long black arm jerked back, pulling his shoulder along with it. Gore exploded from the wound, sinew stretched and did its best to hold on until my father's arm was separated completely. I stumbled forward in a daze. "Stop," I begged them. "Please, stop." The creature at Miss Danby's side rose to face me. I cowered as it stepped closer, the warmth of tears stinging my bony cheeks. "Don't let them kill him. I'll come with you. I'll do anything." It tilted its head. Despite the fact they didn't speak, I knew intrinsically that it could understand me. If only I could say the same about it. It glanced back at my father, now surrounded by 4 of them. There was so much blood, too much blood. I couldn't tell what they'd done to him. His screams had grown quite weak. A sob shook my shoulders. The creature moved like a flash of lightning bursting through the sky. It wrapped its willowy arms around me, scooping me up against its chest. "No," I gasped, beating my fists against it. "Put me down." It turned and darted off into the forest, away from the rocks. It moved quickly, weaving with expert precision through trees and over stones. If the others noticed, if the others followed, we had enough of a head start to outrun them. Rain still leaked out from the sky above, but would soon end. The creatures wouldn't be able to leave, not for me. Not for another year. When we emerged out onto the darkened street, I found my mother sitting on the dented hood of the car. It was running, somehow, pulled back and away from the trunk it had slammed into. She had her hand raised to her mouth, chewing anxiously at her nails, her eyes stained red. The creature lowered me to the ground, and my mother gasped as she noticed me. She rushed toward us, only to falter as she got close enough to see the creature up close. I covered the distance instead, stooping to throw my arms around her neck. "Your father," she said. "Is he gone?" I mumbled, sniffling. "He's gone." She nodded, and stepped back from me. "Get in the car, Hallie." I stepped forward, and then paused. The creature stayed put behind me, watching warily as its daughter left it for the second time. This time of its own volition. I met its purple eyes, glossy and filled with grief. I knew that it wouldn't be back to chase me down in the coming years. The same couldn't be said for the others. Whatever this creature was, whatever I was, it loved me. "Come with us," I said. I could hear my human mother sucking in a startled breath behind me. She didn't argue though. Didn't question it. She, of course, loved me too. That's what made it so surprising when it stepped forward toward the car. We packed into the back seat, huddling together as my mom pulled back onto the highway. The rain had slowed into an unenthusiastic drizzle. A purple-pink sunrise peeked over the skyline. I smiled at the creature next to me, and reached out to grab its hand. My family was going home. The nurse sitting across from me was looking inside the binder, confused. She flipped through one page after another, sifting through progress notes and orders. Around us were the sounds of a dozen other voices speaking at the same time, discussing patients and their care plans, bed movements and medications, physiotherapy and discharge follow-ups. "I just met him this morning," she said. "I wish I could be of more help, but like I said, he's a John Doe, so we don't know much about him. Ah, here it is. Maybe this will give us something." There was a hastily scrawled progress note from the day of admission. It read, "Integumentary. Midline abdolateral incision appears to be infected. Wound covered with newspaper. On admission per triage. Purulent drainage noted. Erythema, foul smell. Possibly old pericardial incision but no sternular femoral sites found. Will order wound care to assess and follow." That's it. I guess so. It's been really busy lately, though. They probably didn't have a lot of time. There were other notes as well, but nothing concerning the wound. "Alright, I guess I'll just have to take a look at the thing for myself," I said, standing up. "Is he with it?" That's hospital code for, is he going to hit me, or scream bloody murder, when I rip the bandage off? Is he confused, or is he with it? She hesitated. "No, not with it, I wouldn't say. But then it's hard to really tell. He doesn't say anything, and if you try to look him in the eyes he just looks right through you. Sounds like he's probably confused. Maybe non-verbal." "Yeah, I would have thought so too. But there's something about him. You know how they say you can see intelligence in the eyes? Well, when I look him in the eyes, or try to, it's like there's some." She stopped and looked embarrassed. "Some what?" This is going to sound stupid. I should probably just stop talking. There were people all around, but nobody was listening. The other nurses and doctors had other topics on their minds and were all engaged in other matters. "What is it?" I asked, curious now. Her face softened and she opened up and told me. "It's like when you look him in the eyes there's somebody really wise looking back at you. Somebody way smarter than me. It's almost like he doesn't want to look at you because he's off somewhere else in his mind, or like he doesn't think we're worth his time. Like I said, this probably sounds really stupid." "Not at all," I said back to her, thinking I would have to go and see for myself. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked. "It's okay, you're busy. Go ahead and deal with your other patients. If you hear me calling for you, just come give me a hand, will you?" "For sure," she said and quickly ran off to deal with other matters. Call bells were ringing constantly, and around every corner someone was coming quickly with a tray of food or a stretcher, a cleaning cart or a medication cup in hand. I made my way through the semi-organized chaos, and walked down the hallway towards room 14. It was the furthest room from the nursing station, and as I walked past a few others I heard patients inside calling out, screaming, wailing in pain and terror of invisible enemies. I stopped once or twice and looked in to see nurses were already engaged in helping some of them, while other staff members put on bright yellow isolation gowns and gloves, and prepared to enter different rooms. The powerful odor of infection wafted out of room 14 as I approached. I doused myself with hand sanitizer like a priest with holy water at the threshold and quickly gowned and gloved, walking into the room, and into the thick of it. As I entered room 14 I saw a man lying in bed. He was staring at the ceiling and did not acknowledge me when I said my greetings. "Hello, sir. My name is Jerome, and I'm a wound care nurse. I'm here to take a look at your dressing. I hear you've got a bit of a hole in your abdomen there, and the doctors would like me to see what I can do to help. Is that okay with you?" I stepped forward and stood at the side of the bed. Pushing the button on the side of the bed rail, I made the whole thing go up, raising it to waist height. "I'm just going to pull back the sheets and take a look here, okay?" Again he said nothing. I pulled down the bed sheets and pulled up his hospital gown, revealing a hairy chest and abdomen with a patchwork of bandages covering his stomach. Slowly, I began to pull them away one by one. I watched his face closely, ready to back away at any sign of anger or agitation. The pericardial incision is typically made during a CABG, coronary artery bypass graft procedure, more commonly known as open heart surgery. But it is one of several large cuts made during the procedure. The sternum will have a large vertical incision at the midline of the chest. There will also be incisions made in one or both legs, depending on the quantity of artery being harvested for the procedure. This is all important for the simple reason that Mr. John Doe had none of these scars. No wounds from any other surgical incisions. And yet here was this long lateral scar on his abdomen, isolated and alone. No other wounds anywhere. The man appeared malnourished and thin, like he hadn't eaten anything in a very long time. The nurse had said he was refusing to eat, and the next step was to insert a nasogastric tube later that day. Looking at the wound, I saw it was macerated and red, wet and white in places, pretty like fingers after being in the bath for too long. There was an odor coming from it, a rank and putrescent stink like death and infection. My job could be interesting and rewarding some days, but this was shaping up to be a hell of a morning. Of course I had no idea. Not yet. The smell only became worse as I began my work. I cleansed the wound with a massive amount of saline, and watched as yellow pus seeped out in vast quantities. Once it began to run clear I dried it with gauze as best as I could. The whole time the man just stared at the ceiling, looking like he was far superior to all of this, like none of it was important. I quickly cleansed my hands with hand sanitizer, then laid out my sterile field. I set out my fresh sterile gloves, and opened my dressing tray and my packing ways. Also I took out a swab, so I could measure the depth of the hole. All the while it seeped and stank. The wound edges seemed to move and twitch as I worked, as if it was a mouth, and I was a dentist poking around inside. But that was silly, I thought to myself. It was just the visor fogging up, distorting my vision, of course. I managed to measure its width and height, but couldn't determine the depth. The whole while I was observing the patient's face and seeing he didn't flinch or grimace with any of my prodding. I was thankful he wasn't swinging at me, at least, as some others did. Next was the final part of everything. I just had to pack the wound, and cover it with a dry dressing, then I could finally get away from the smell of that room. Deciding it would take far too long with tweezers, I simply used the sterile gloves to pack the hole in the man's abdomen. I lightly began to fill the wound, starting at the outside edges. As my hand went into the center of it, I began to feel something pulling hard on my fingers like one of those finger trap toys I had played with as a kid. The sensation was so unusual and bizarre given the circumstance that I was completely shocked and couldn't even open my mouth to scream. I just tried to wrench my hand away desperately. The thing inside the man's abdomen held fast. Then something sharp started to slice into my finger, and that was enough to bring me back to reality, and I remembered I could call for help. I let out a howling scream, wailing at the top of my lungs in horror and pain. Looking at the man's face, I saw he was no longer catatonic. He was staring straight at me now, his blue eyes shining with satisfied intelligence. He appeared to me suddenly like a man who has not eaten for a very long time, who was finally getting a meal. My screams rang out in the room, but I realized with dawning terror that the other confused patients in the room surrounding this one were also screaming loudly, probably drowning out my calls for help. As my eyes darted around the room for something to help the situation, I felt my hand getting sucked in like a ramen noodle being slurped up by a greedy mouth. Sharp teeth dug into the flesh of my fingers at the same time, and then were up to my knuckles, then my palm. I reached over with my other hand and tried to pull my wrist, trying to yank it free. It hurt more than anything I had ever felt in my life, as I pulled against the razor-sharp teeth, and they ripped through my flesh. The man's face was smug and self-satisfied, and I felt his stomach mouth pull me in deeper, now ingesting my hand nearly up to the wrist. I pulled my other hand away as it tried to suck that one in too. The whole time I continued to scream and scream, now using my foot as leverage against the bed frame, doing anything I could to get it out, to get it away. It felt like fire in my hand, burning me up to my wrist. The pain was so severe I felt like I would black out, but I managed to stay conscious as I fought, and pulled against the strength of this horrifying alien creature. I glanced again at the man's face and saw his tongue look black inside his mouth, his teeth yellowed and missing in places. He began to laugh. But the sound didn't come from his face. Just as the world began to go red and then black around the edges, I heard a sound from behind me of someone entering the room. My wrist was frayed, as if the giant mouth had merely opened up and released it. I fell backwards against the wall, my forearm a bleeding stump that I held up and looked at dumbly. The nurses who entered the room said later that they didn't see the man smiling or hear him laughing as they entered. He looked catatonic as always. What they did see was a hysterical nurse on the floor, weeping and screaming and missing a hand. A trail of blood leading to the bedside and to a hole in the man's abdomen. A very unusual wound that was now turned up at the edges. Are you bored? Are you lonely and bored? Do you have a lot of time on your hands? Do you have hands? I'm offering you a proposal, with potential financial compensation for your troubles. It may sound off-putting at first blush, but hear me out. I am looking for a human host. And I mean a willing human host who might be willing to give up some of their time to help out an odd fellow that doesn't have hands or blood. Am I asking to control your body? Yes. Sometimes. You'll still be there, but taking the back seat. Now you're probably thinking, that sounds no fun. I don't want to spend all my time riding shotgun. And that's valid. But you all spend about half of the day unconscious anyway. Your body is just there, doing nothing, a complete waste. As for me, I don't sleep, so we could have it, so that during the day, I will graciously let you do fun human things, and at night, I'll do whatever. And by whatever, I mean perfectly safe, perfectly reasonable activities. I don't drink, and I rarely go outside. I enjoy baking, I look at pictures of birds online. I've been getting into neuroscience lately. Very interesting stuff. You're all very interesting. And maybe you're still thinking, hey now, I don't want some random mind-controlling thingy hauling my body around in my sleep, Weekend at Bernie's style, to which I say, you're no fun, and you're not the kind of person I want to live with anyway. But I'm a light sleeper, you say. Don't worry. I can isolate your somatosensory cortex, so you can't feel anything. But my family will think it's weird, you say. Don't worry. You don't have to tell them. Actually, I would prefer that you don't tell anyone. Please. And should anyone question me, I'm not bad at impressions. I'll get really good at a you impression. It'll be the first thing I do. I know this all sounds very strange and potentially unpleasant, but remember the financial compensation that may or may not be happening. Hell, I'll even do some of your chores if you like, while you sleep. You can wake up and the dishes will be done, laundry folded and coffee made. Doesn't that sound nice? And then you open the fridge and oh, what's this? Someone baked banana bread last night. That was me. I baked banana bread last night. Now I should say, I don't have a lot of standards. I really don't. But I do, unfortunately, have some, so let's just get them out of the way, before I waste your time. Please do not contact me, if you have any of the following. Okay. Sorry, it's just not going to work out. I can pay for iron supplements, but I can't work miracles. A weak immune system. I don't like getting sick, I'm sorry. It's gross, sick people are gross. I mean, I know it's not your fault, but healthy folks only, please. A strong immune system. Yes, I know what I just said, but I also don't want to be attacked by your immune system. So maybe you're not the picture of health, but you're just kind of okay. I'm looking for someone who is just kind of okay. A penchant for alcohol, it makes me feel strange. A name that starts with a P, I'm not the greatest at speaking. It's hard, moving air through your throat and moving your tongue, and your mouth at the same time. You all do it so easy, can't say I'm not envious. I'm the worst at making the P sound. I intentionally avoid any P word in conversation, and get by well enough, but I look pretty foolish, if I'm cavorting about, pretending to be you, and I can't even say your own name. Those are my standards, but really, other than that, I'll take anyone. I don't care if you're male or female or whatever. I don't care if you're gay. I don't care if you're smart. I don't care if you don't have a lawyer. There are so many things that I don't care about. Now, I've specified all the ways in which I could compensate you, and how our relationship will be not in any way problematic, but I want to stress that, above all things, I am looking for a friend. Someone I can spend quiet evenings with. If you want to hang out with me during the day, that's great. I can give you fun hallucinations. Or you could have hallucinations the normal way, like by reading, like what you're doing now. I love to read. I love doing funny voices. I wonder what you think I sound like. I hope I sound nice. And one of the best things about me is I'm very quiet. No one else will be able to hear me except you. I'll be like your own personal friend that only you know. Like a secret friend. And you don't even have to talk to me, because I can read your thoughts. I suppose I should tell you a bit more about myself, since you're still reading. I was born in the Everglades, I think. It's been a while. But I remember being so cold, and so alone, but then I met this sweaty man in a colorful t-shirt, with a camera, and half a granola bar, and with blood so hot. So yeah, he was my first host, and I'll admit, we weren't the best of friends. It was a confusing time for both of us. I was confused. He was confused. What happened was really both of our faults, you could say. He was a bird watcher, if I recall correctly. Just watched birds all the time. I thought it might have been out of jealousy. Watching those little things flying around makes you feel kind of stuck. I felt stuck. So I decided to be a bird for a while to see if it was really all it's cracked up to be. Squished myself into the body of this lovely American crow. We settled down, built a nest, and laid several nice, healthy eggs with a man bird by the name of Richard Baxter. He was a very proud bird, very large. And he gave me so many wonderful gifts. Like children, and also small pieces of plastic. I still have all of them. The plastic, not the children. I'd never been so happy. All these hormones had me consumed in the joy of motherhood, but the crow's health was failing. I could not sustain myself. Its pathetic little heart beat weaker and weaker. I tried starving, I tried everything I could. I wanted to be a bird so bad. But it just wasn't working out. The bird stopped working. The other crows held a funeral service for me, even though I was still alive. I tried to tell them, but I'm not good at speaking, you remember. It was all just a big mess. I haven't seen Baxter since, but I still think about him a lot. Is that weird? I'm totally over it though. After that incident, I got kind of depressed, but I was too much of a coward to do much about it. I possessed a lot of trash animals, gulls, raccoons, and salespeople. I did what I could to survive. That's kind of where I am now. I am currently living in Miami, Florida. Been body surfing almost every day, haha. Right now I'm using a library computer and a librarian. She does not like being possessed. Boy howdy are these fingers twitching. But you can thank her for my halfway decent grammar. I'm tired of feeling like a parasite. I want to try a different approach. I want to be friends. Like with Richard Baxter, except I also live in your brain and drink your blood sometimes. But I'll make you bread in your sleep, so it's okay. It's been really hard finding someone willing to put up with me. I've tried everything. So I thought I would put up an advertisement online. Why not? Can't say the P word in real life, but you can hear it in your head loud enough, I hope. I know I kept saying that I would compensate you financially, but I'm going to be real with you. I don't have much. I've got like 20 bucks, some small pieces of plastic and a book about finance. But I'm a real hoot. So please, if you are interested, leave your comments below. I would love to get to know you. I need to go now. The library is closing soon, but I'll get back as soon as I can.
Few days later.
Just borrowed someone's mobile device and also fingers, so I can now respond. My name is James now. It was my wife who suggested roleplay, despite what she may say elsewhere. You'll just have to decide who you think is being honest. When she first suggested acting out roles, I was hoping for pigtails and pleated skirts, but I should have figured it wouldn't be like that. If I'm honest, there isn't much that I wouldn't have agreed to at that point in our relationship. Things weren't bad, but, well, they weren't good either. One morning I woke up to a packed lunch and an orange juice on the breakfast table, and when I tried to make myself a cup of coffee, she told me that growing boys shouldn't drink things like that. I typically skipped breakfast and headed right out the door each morning, but the way she sat there looking at me made me feel like I was missing something. It took me a minute to realize that this right here was the start of our little pretend play, so I sat down and ate the cereal and drank the juice. The whole scene made me pretty uncomfortable. I guess I just felt on the spot. Sounds weird, but I've always had a bit of a thing about people cooking for me. My mum died when I was 8, and my dad didn't really pay me much attention. I had to cook and clean and iron my uniform every night before school, and no one ever did my homework for me. Later on, my dad married some poor waitress half his age, and treated her like a servant. And I realized that must have been exactly how he had treated my mother. I'm not saying that this taught me to be the perfect man or anything, far from it. I just didn't like things that made me feel like I was becoming my dad. But there was my wife, making me cereal for breakfast, and then handing me a neat little lunchbox with cartoons on it that I'd watched as a kid. Goku, that was a throwback. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't like some part of it. Driving to work that day, I decided that this roleplay was probably just some kind of therapy, and that it was best to go along with it. Even after I got home that night to find that she'd run me a bath. Not only did she want me to be a clean little boy, she'd even laid out some brand new pajamas. It was deeply uncomfortable. She perched on the toilet lid, while I was sat upright in the tepid water, not sure what to do with myself. A grown man with a beer belly hunched over in grey water. I felt so stupid. "Do you need help washing yourself?" she cooed. Sure," I replied, and she came over and pulled out a fish-shaped bottle of No Tears shampoo. She washed my hair, using a small plastic cup to rinse my scalp. I had to lean back for her to get it all, and she held my head in her hands. I hated it. My eyes wouldn't stay shut, her hands were too cold, the water too warm, the porcelain of the tub too hard. And every time the water flowed over my head, I would reflexively lurch forward and try to sit up, which of course meant I got suds in my eyes. "Shush," she kept saying. "Just lie back. It won't hurt. I won't let it." So I laid back and controlled my breathing and told myself that it was for her sake, not mine. One of my last memories of my mother was her reading a book while I sat in the bath, and I guess I didn't like how I felt in my wife's arms at that moment. But she just kept talking to me in that soothing voice, and somewhere along the lines I let go of conscious thought and focused on the sensation of the warm water rolling down my scalp. "You can let go," she said, wiping some water from my face, and when I looked up at her, I realized that I was shaking, and my heart was pounding. All of a sudden it all just came out, all the tension, all the anxiety, the constant state of near panic that I'd suppressed for my entire life. You're meant to say that this kind of stuff feels cathartic, but I fucking hated it. It made me feel physically sick, even a little ashamed. She held me in her arms, while I sobbed like a baby in the tub, and when it was finally over all I could think was, "Thank God I can breathe again." I let her dry me as I stood dripping wet on the tiles. And then I let her dress me in the cool dry pajamas she'd laid out ready, the silky fabric raising goosebumps on my skin. By the time I curled up into bed, her arms cradling my head like it was a precious jewel. I was exhausted, like I'd just gone for a quick 30-mile run. The last thing I remember was the theme tune to Ed, Ed and Eddie, and the flood of nostalgia combined with the feel of fresh bed linen put me to sleep hard and fast. The next day at work I felt dirty, and I didn't much enjoy the thought of going home. I knew what was waiting for me, and sure enough she was there with SpongeBob pajamas, brand new, in one hand, and a plate of food in another. At first I told her I wasn't up for it that night, but she just told me to stop being silly, and sit down to eat. And well, the food did look good. And, stupid as this is, I told myself it was me doing her a favor, you know. Like if I just agreed to have her do all this stuff for me, it would be okay, so long as I agreed begrudgingly. So I ate the food, and wore the clothes, and I tried not to cringe when she called me her baby boy. As much as I hated it, she was being really nice to me. I just wanted her to like me. She hadn't liked me in so long, and this whole messed up business meant that she was being genuinely affectionate to me. For years she'd always kinda looked at me like I was a dick. I don't know where, but somewhere along the line I stopped being her husband, and just became a husband, just another emotionally stunted guy with a receding hairline. I could have been more attentive, I know that, but nobody told me how exhausting mediocrity is, and by the time I got through barely surviving work each day, I'd find very little energy left to give to her. I felt lonely all the time, and something about being in her arms made me feel a little less alone. I secretly hoped that this roleplay was about dismantling the walls we'd both put up. It wasn't on my terms, I would have picked literally anything else. But hey, when is life ever fully on anyone's terms? Being in love really means being held hostage. And yeah, things were bad, but man, I fucking loved her with everything I had. So I had to work with what I had, and what I had was this weird roleplay. Figured that it makes some sense, that some women didn't want a daddy. That instead some women actually wanted to be a mommy. You see it online all the time, right? Daddy this, daddy that. You can't throw a stone online without finding some pornographic image of a woman being infantilized. So why couldn't it go the other way around? So long as it wasn't sexual, I figured I could do it. I'd wear the pajamas, watch cartoons, and ask for help coloring in the lines. In the end, I didn't just go along with it for a few nights. I went along with it every single day that followed, and I found that every day there was a little more of it to go along with. The packed lunches became more elaborate, the food I ate grew simplified, until it was practically the kind of stuff you'd feed a toddler. And one Friday when I finally told her I wanted a break, she just told me to stop being silly. She used that phrase a lot during the roleplay, and this is going to sound fucking stupid, but she made me feel silly when she said it. Her voice immediately made me feel small and ashamed, just like I had in the bath, and before I even realized I was doing it. I was sliding the pajamas on and booting up my Xbox while she messed around in the kitchen. I'd actually planned on talking to her that night about going to couples therapy, but she spoke to me like a little boy, and I just couldn't stop myself reacting like one. It was like I'd been trained. That weekend I listened to her tell me stories as I sat on the counter kicking my legs, and I think I felt something die inside me. On some level I have to take some responsibility. I ate the food I wanted to eat, and when she asked if there was anything I wanted, I always had something to say. I watched the TV I wanted to and wore the clothes she put out for me, and pretty soon I got used to not thinking about those things. Pretty soon every single day was spent with her. Some nights were movie nights and we'd watch her favorite films, while she told me all about the memories she had of first watching them. Some nights were mommy nights where she'd sit and drink wine and watch her own shows while I played games. We made forts out of cushions, camped in the backyard, played cowboy and Indian using Nerf guns, and chased each other round the house for hours at a time, doing hide and seek, or some homebrew version of tag. If I had to describe this time, it was like being in a waiting room, only I didn't have a number or a clock or any way of knowing how much time has passed. The only way I could even tell that time was passing was that I lost weight. In fact, I lost a lot of weight. My wedding ring slipped right off my finger one day, and where it went after that, I'll never know. I still don't understand this part of it, but I remember that I just kept getting thinner. For about 3 weeks I fell ill with some stomach bug. And I spent my days in bed watching telly while she checked my temperature and fed me chicken soup. And by the time I came out of it, I was wearing a child's large set of pajamas. I mean, how does that even work, right? I started the year weighing 120 kilograms. In the end I got down to 45. Not only that, but my hair started getting thin and downy, and I couldn't even remember when I'd last needed a shave. I asked her about this one day, and she played it dumb, like she didn't know what was happening to me. But out of the two of us, she must have known, because it was literally right in front of her eyes. I was changing. She recommended that I stay home until I felt 100% myself again, which of course meant that I never went back to work because I never ever felt like myself a guy. Looking back, it wouldn't surprise me if she forged a resignation letter of mine, or did something similar to keep me at home. Either way, by the time the stomach bug passed, I was trapped in that house. The outer gate, that had once barely reached my chest, now towered over my head and I could barely get my fingers around the bars. It wasn't a new gate, or at least I didn't think it was. It was just somehow taller than me all of a sudden. Things stopped making sense around this time, and looking back it's hard to disentangle certain memories and ideas. I don't even remember the crib arriving. It was just there one day, along with a whole new room in the house that physically shouldn't have been there. I checked one late night when I felt lucid, and sure enough the bathroom and master bedroom hadn't magically shrunk by 50%. But somehow a whole new room had just sprung up between them. And it was painted in baby blue, and the walls were covered in paintings of airplanes, and if I stared at them too long I'd feel real sleepy, and my head would get heavy and boom. Next thing I remember, it'd be morning and I'd be staring at a bowl of cereal. Whole chunks of time were purged from my head. And not just the recent stuff either. I was an accountant who suddenly couldn't do long division, and struggled with his multiplication tables. Normally my brain was like a cacophony of fireworks that took every ounce of my willpower to keep under control. Stray thoughts just pinged off all the time, and it was chaotic, but it was me. But with my wife. And with everything going on, it had turned into something more like a cobweb with holes poked in it. You know when you listen to someone, and their voice just turns into a drone, and you realize that you stopped listening after a few words. It was like that, but with my own thoughts. As soon as I got any momentum going, I lost interest and time faded, and I'd come to a few hours later bouncing up and down on my wife's knee. I could practically feel bits of my mind sloughing away like candle wax, leaving big patches of nothing behind, and it hurt so bad. It hurt worse than anything physical that ever happened during that fucked up time. Something was cutting my mind up like a scrapbooker going at old magazines, and I could feel it happening in real time. There were times when she'd take something off me like the remote and put it on the counter, and it'd just hang there over my head, and that just doesn't make sense to me. And the harder I concentrate to try and figure that out, the more it feels like staring right at the sun. And it wasn't just me. There were a couple of moments when she'd look at me, and I wouldn't see my wife. Actually, that's not right. She was my wife. Absolutely 100% my wife. She just had an extra 2 pairs of limbs and... It hurts even now to try and remember too clearly. What I do know was that as time went on, I felt less like precious cargo and more like a leaden weight she had to lug from place to place. Some nights I'd wake up and spot her stood in my doorway looking at me, and the expression on her face. Holy shit, it was murderous. I'd have to lie there and pretend for hours that I was snoring gently because on some level I just knew it'd be bad news. The time we spent together started to change, and more often than not I'd try to stay out in the garden and play with toys. Only I wasn't really playing. I was just pretending, hoping that if my performance was good then she wouldn't get any more irritated with me. Without knowing when, why, or how, rules were introduced. I'd go to do something like make myself a drink and stop, hand frozen halfway to an empty glass, and remember that I wasn't allowed to get glasses out of the cupboard by myself. I didn't know how I knew that. I just knew it. I wasn't allowed to play games past 7. I wasn't allowed to get my own snacks. I wasn't allowed in the garden without telling her where I was going. And if I broke these rules... One time I threw a ball and broke a window, and she exploded out of that screen door like a fucking bull. It felt so wrong to feel scared of her. She was meant to be looking after me. Those were the roles we were meant to be playing. But she grabbed my arm, and pulled it so hard it popped right out the socket, and I begged for the game to stop, but nothing I said could snap us out of these fucked up roles we'd made. She dragged me into the house, and I passed out around about the time my head bounced off the 3rd step on our porch. When I woke up I was sat in a high chair and strapped in real good. Something hurt but I ignored it. All I wanted was for this pissed off woman to love me again. I was so terrified I would have done anything she asked. She was the only thing I had to keep me safe in the world, and my head was full of all the amazing stuff she did for me. The food, the gifts, the movies, the clothes, the bathing. I could see how tired she was. It was me making her that tired. So I cried and I sobbed, and I said sorry so often my throat got sticky and dry, and I started to heave. When her terrible frown finally broke, she ran towards me with her arms wide open, and pulled me out of that chair. She told me to never make her hurt me again, saying it over and over again as she sat me down on the sofa and rolled up my pajamas to show me my chubby legs. Something was jutting out of the skin, and before I could figure out what it was, she pinched it with her finger and thumb, and drew it out in one long motion. It was a needle, a little sewing needle that had been slid painfully into the thick fatty muscle of my thigh. There have to be rules, she said. And there have to be consequences. But don't worry, I want you to know it hurts me just as much as it hurts you. We both suffer when you break the rules. I want you to know that you don't just hurt yourself, you hurt me. I watched as she placed the bloody needle on her tongue and swallowed it. When the doorbell rang, I was looking at the diapers around my waist. I didn't know when or how they had gotten there, and weirdly I remembered thinking the exact same thing that morning. And the morning before that. The longer I thought about it, the harder it was for me to remember when I'd last actually used a toilet. The realization horrified me. Some of the memories flashing into my head, it was like I was experiencing them for the first time all over. The timid woman I'd married was somehow suddenly so strong, able to not only overpower me, but able to actually lift me off the ground, to pick me up and lay me down on a small table and hoist my legs up and... Jesus Christ, she changed me, I thought, and my whole body flushed with unspeakable humiliation. I think it was that feeling that let me keep my head together when the deliveryman came, like I had this little bit of defiance that stopped me trying to hide from the stranger. This is my chance, I thought. Wait, no, I'm not allowed to open the door, not for strangers. But I can speak to him. Maybe he can help. Someone has to help. But if she comes and finds me, then I'm in trouble. I don't want to be in trouble. It was like being drunk, or like having my thoughts handcuffed to a maniac. I had to fight every step of the way to stay a man, and not a child, and I pulled at the handle eager to get some perspective on what was happening to me. Only I never got to even see the guy because that was when the bathroom door slammed shut. She's coming. And I knew that, if she found me, then I'd get one hell of a punishment. My legs and arms already hurt so bad. I wasn't a very good boy. I knew. I broke a lot of rules, and it didn't help that new ones were popping up all the time. I fled towards the kitchen, turning the corner just in time for the door to swing open, and for this delivery guy to get a good look at me. I briefly turned to face him, and the way he reacted to the sight of me, I expected to feel embarrassed, but I just felt scared. Something was happening to me, and the fact that this guy could see it made it horrifyingly real. My body had changed, and no matter what my wife wanted, I wasn't a child. I was changing into something, but it wasn't a normal kid. This wasn't Benjamin Button. Whatever happens when you cram a chubby middle-aged guy into a 3-foot package, the result isn't a cute little kid. It's a nightmare. I ran crying from the look in his eye and got as far as the garden, when I heard my wife thunder into his living room. "Who let you in?" she cried. "I have children in this house. Who are you and why are you in my home?" Poor guy was dumbstruck. I could hear him stammering away as I ran under the porch steps and waited. I'd learned this was one of the few places where she couldn't physically fit. The few times I'd hidden under there, she had to calm herself down, and that made things a little easier on me. At least in the short term. Now I hoped it'd keep me safe long enough that I could maybe even make a break for it when the guy left the gate. She childproofed it with some infuriating mechanism that my fat fingers couldn't work. But it sure did take a long time for that gate to swing open and close, and that right there was the best chance I was ever gonna get. "Get out of my house," she screamed at him as he flew down the steps. She followed, hot on his heels. "Who's your manager? Who do you work for? I want to put in a complaint. I want you to know exactly how goddamn badly you've messed up." This guy was stuttering and mumbling and fumbling, unsure of whether to run away or turn and give this woman a decent account of himself. I hoped he would leave. I was hidden so well, and if he opened that gate, then I would finally have a chance to get the hell away from this living nightmare. This guy was still trying to answer when my wife stepped down onto the path and turned to me slyly, raising one eyebrow right in my direction, where I thought I was hitting. Jesus Christ, the terror I felt. I pissed myself. I thought I got one over on her, but she knew the whole time and she had something planned. "Look at this," she said. "Look at this step. This wasn't damaged until you came along." The guy looked confused as hell and I couldn't blame him. He'd been bombarded with conflicting complaints. It was like he was grasping at air to understand everything he'd seen. It wasn't just my wife going off at him. It was the memory of what he'd seen. It was the memory of me. Bent down to take a look, and my wife encouraged him to get closer. I wondered why she was making him get so close to my hiding spot. Did she want to humiliate me? Did she want to parade the little freak around? I thought she must have known how much my body upset me, and she was going to use that fact to torture me a little bit. But it was nothing that tame. Without warning, his face slammed into the middle step, his head bouncing off like a coconut. Only she was there ready to catch it, and before either one of us could figure it out, she had shoved his head right back against the wooden step. He started to swear, then shout, then cry, and then finally he screamed. And screamed. And screamed. It lasted so long. She never stopped pushing, and somehow, impossibly, he started to give way. The sides of his skull started to crumple, his eyes bulged, his teeth popped out and fell to the floor like coins from a slot machine. I had to pull my legs up just to keep them from landing on my bare feet. I had front row seats to the worst fucking horror show I could ever think of, watching that guy get scalped in slow motion. Only it didn't stop at his head. She kept pushing until his shoulders started to pop and crack. Arms bent backwards, bones snapped, muscle and skin were peeled off with a sound like Velcro. In the end he poured out of that little 6-inch gap, and fell onto the floor in a quivering pile of skin and flesh. The only thing left on the other side was my wife's face staring at me through the gore-coated wood. "Come on," she grinned. "Put your new toy away. I'll make you some lunch." I was sitting outside pretending to watch the clouds go by, aware that she was behind the kitchen window and pretending to wash dishes. He was looking right at me, even if I couldn't see her. I'd watched her clean that guy up, watched her dump him in an old compost pile round back. He wasn't the only one down there. I saw all my old clothes, my laptop, my phone, my keys, my mail, everything that used to be me, and I'm not just talking about things. I'd never really thought of it much, but I'd shrunk and changed, and I guess all that meat and bone and fat had to go somewhere. I just hadn't realized that she tied it up in dripping bed sheets and plopped it at the farthest point in our yard. I don't know how to explain it. Couldn't even begin to tell you how it feels to grieve your own body like that. Whatever defiance I had was gone, especially after seeing what she did to that delivery guy. Coming to terms with who, or rather what I was, meant that I lost all desire to escape. I would have tried to overdose, if it wasn't against the rules for me to go anywhere near the medicine cabinet. I ran a thumb across the purple and yellow flesh of my thigh, the skin riddled with 1,000 infected puncture marks. Can't break the rules, I thought. When a frisbee floated freely over the hedge, I stared at it for a moment like I was a disinterested cat. My eyes tracked it, but nobody was home upstairs, if you get what I mean. Only when it landed gently on the grass, and I heard the gate clang open, did it dawn on me that I wasn't alone out there. It was a little girl, and her reaction wasn't all that different to the delivery man's. She stopped dead in her tracks, and started to cry a loud distress wail. I wanted to ask her for help, but I didn't want to face the way she looked at me, so I quietly scuttled off towards the bushes to hide. Or at least I started to. That was when I heard the screen door bang, and my wife came down the steps with a big smile on her face. "It's okay," she cooed, reaching out to hold the girl. Only our visitor couldn't see the kitchen knife my wife clutched behind her. "I won't let anyone ever hurt you." When she started walking towards our kitchen door, something broke. I felt a special kind of hatred burn inside me. It wasn't a defiance so much as pure spite. The kind of feeling that it'd make you scream "I hate you" over and over at your parents, just to see them hurt. It sounds stupid, but as much as part of me wanted to keep that little girl safe, another part of me was just plain old jealous. After everything my wife had done to me, I couldn't bear the thought of her bringing another child into the house. I started to run towards the two of them, and my wife, spotting me, hoisted the girl up into her arms. Only that slowed her down so much that I reached them both before she'd even got up the first step. I tried to grab the girl's coat when I jumped, but wound up grabbing a fistful of hair. Everything that happened next was a jumble, but my wife slashed my arm and wrist with that big knife of hers, and I pulled so hard on the poor girl's head that a load of her hair came free in my arm. In the end, though, I think it helped, because this girl started screaming like hell, and when she got a good look at me, that was when the fear really kicked in, and she started wriggling and kicking and punching. And my wife, who really wasn't ready for just how hard it can be to keep a hold of a pissed-off kid, ended up dropping the little girl. Once her feet were on the ground, that kid just zipped right out of there, and I did everything I could to keep my wife away from her. It wasn't a whole lot, but I think it helped. I think between the way my messed up appearance got the girl running, and the way I managed to hold onto my wife's legs for long enough to trip her up a little, I think I saved that kid. Looking back on everything that my wife cost me, I guess that was one of the few little victories I ever had. As soon as the gate clanged shut, all that feeling of triumph dribbled away. I crawled back towards the porch steps as quick as I could, and the best way to describe it is that, even though I wasn't looking at her, when my wife's eyes found me, I could feel them. Her rage, it must be what it's like to stand next to radioactive waste. I swore my shadow got darker, and the ground got a little hotter. And the noises I heard, they didn't sound like they came from an upset woman. Not sure what they sounded like really, except maybe a strange kinda clicking. When I finally got under the house and turned, I saw that she looked big enough to crush a man like a bug. I don't know how to describe it, except it was a little like looking at something with 3D glasses, or the way your eyes feel funny just before a big migraine, I guess. For just a second I saw her as something that wasn't human, but the part that really hurts my head is that she never changed. It was the same entity I'd married on the altar, only now I got the same feeling I did looking at dead spiders or leathery roadkill. She'd never really been human, had she? And with my memory shot to shit, I wasn't even willing to bet that I'd even married this thing. You read about those parasites that lay eggs in their hosts? Looking at her as she scuttled towards me, yeah, I got the sense that's what she was. Some kinda parasite. She stopped just a few inches from the steps, her face peering at me through the gaps. She blinked with a third set of eyelids, and smiled so white her skin started to lose its color and break. "I will drown you in my womb," she said, as calmly as she would ask if I wanted cut up hot dogs in my spaghetti. I believed her. I didn't come out of those stairs for the rest of that day, not even when my wife stood out on the porch and called me for dinner. I didn't fancy my chances with whatever was shambling around up there and pretending to be a wife or a mother. Or whatever else it felt like. I didn't want anything she'd prepared. And as time wore on, I found that the hunger in my stomach sharpened my mind so that I didn't mind it too much. Besides, I could hazard a guess that she wasn't being honest about what was in my food, and I didn't want anything she prepared. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't really a game now. The stakes were too high. And for me, tucked away under those steps with my stomach growling and my mind growing more lucid with every passing second, I really started to hate her. I hated that she'd hurt me when she was supposed to protect me. I hated that she'd lied every second of every day until this sick little plan of hers had come to fruition. But more than anything, I hated her for what she'd done to me. I wasn't a man, but I sure as hell wasn't a child. I was more like a monster and a joke, and I just knew that somehow she'd been the one stripping meat and fat off my bones until my frame withered to this pitiable size. I had to leave. I had to. She'd since locked the gate, and I needed the key, and if she stopped me, well, I guess I needed a knife, didn't I? I needed something to keep me safe. I waited until sunset and crawled out from under the house, making sure to stick to the shadows. Peeking through the kitchen window, I saw her stood there with a plate in one hand and a blank expression on her face. She looked a little broken, like she didn't quite know what to do now that I wouldn't listen to her cries of dinner time. She just stood there and shivered until some flicker of movement caught her eye, and she pivoted around to track it like a bird of prey. I had to drop out of sight more than once, because of how sensitive she was to changes in the light, although I think I managed to avoid her line of sight, because when I finally snuck into the house via the back door, she was in the exact same spot, staring into the darkness like a blind man. For a moment I thought I was safe in the shadows, but whatever this thing was, it didn't seem so committed to playing human. As soon as I got near the stairs, her eyes fixed on me like a hound's, and she came barreling forward on every limb she had. What little of her was visible in the moonlight looked almost fish-like, like she'd been pulled out of the bottom of a lake. She still had the general shape of a person, I guess, only it was like something wearing a human suit when that was falling apart. Her joints slipped up and down her bones like they were on a pulley, and they bent backwards and forwards and sideways. As she got closer, I smelled her, and it was like rotten milk and dog shit left in a hot car. It hit me hard enough to water my eyes and make climbing the stairs difficult. Of course, I didn't get very far. I didn't know what the hell was going on, nor did I have strength to fight it. The last thing I remember was the sight of her ribs pressing against her skin like fingers trying to poke through a rubber sheet, like they were alive inside of her and wanted out. "Baby need a feed?" she asked before grabbing my head and slamming it backwards into the step behind me. I awoke with a foul taste in my mouth. I'd been strapped into the high chair, and I looked around groggily until I laid eyes on a baby bottle. The congealed contents were the color of a smoker's fingers, with visible lumps of pink matter lurking towards the bottom like syrup in a milkshake. "Straight from the source," my wife said, her misshapen fingers stroking my hairless head. I realized that my legs were in agony, and I saw that there must have been a dozen needles poking out of my skin and right through the pajamas she dressed me in. She pressed a finger against one, and for a second the pain became so white-hot that I nearly passed out all over again. I fought hard to stay awake, desperate to avoid another feeding. Although a part of me wondered if I wanted to endure the second one while awake. But when it all came down to it, it was just her in my way, wasn't it? And that hatred inside me burned up like a pyre, and I realized that I wouldn't mind dying all that much. I'd secretly hoped for so long that I could maybe fix this somehow, maybe even get back to normal, and get my body back. I didn't know how, but I'd let myself think that it could be possible. Sitting there, looking at her loom over me, I decided that living like this wasn't really an option anymore. My hands were free. Who could blame her for leaving them like that? I couldn't hit her or kick her. I didn't have the reach or the strength. But I did have something sharp, so I reached down and tore a needle free, and before she could try and get it out of my hand, I shoved it through her palm. It went right through like she'd been made of nothing more substantial than some thick wool. It didn't even make a noise, although the stench she emitted became unbearably strong. She looked angry. Good, I thought, and I reached down and grabbed another. And this time she tried to be quicker, but it just meant her face got closer. So close that the moonlight hit it, and for a moment I hesitated because I finally saw just how fucking god-awful she really was. You could see where all that skin was just slipping away, and hanging loose like a badly made mask, and whatever was underneath, it looked a little like a spider. Not a spider's face, mind you. No, Like she had a spider for a face, only it was a spider with too many legs, that were all curled up like it had been stamped on a few times. Like her whole skull was a ball made out of furry rubber bands. But she still had eyes and they looked mostly human. And like I said, she'd gotten in so close I could see those hairs twitch and wriggle, and that meant I could lunge forward and jam that needle right into her eye. Pushing so hard, that by the end it was as embedded in the palm of my hand as it was in her skull, or whatever she had. I don't know what exactly was in there, but it must have hurt because she let out a scream that drew blood from my ears, and she ran off into the dark, desperate to get far, far away from whatever had caused her pain. I didn't have much time. I slipped loose from the chair and ran from the house, stopping only long enough to catch a glimpse of a shadow passing over the house, as if something had flown over. It's hard for me to say what exactly, but I had a vague notion that some of the lampposts in the nearby street were moving, and that they reached way too high into the sky. I felt her leave. Jesus fucking Christ, I felt her leave, and it was like the popping of a cyst. It hurt bad. It hurt like nothing I'd ever felt. It wasn't a protracted injury, just more like being shot, I imagine. I don't know. I reached the gate and saw somehow that my hand dwarfed the lock, and by the time I'd fumbled it open, I was already hurtling towards the ground like a falling tree. I reached the gate and saw somehow that my hand dwarfed the lock, and by the time I'd fumbled it open, I was already hurtling towards the ground like a falling tree. But at least I was the right size again. I wound up having to take a trip to the hospital that same day, so they could get the remaining needles out of my leg. I was laughing so damn hard that they wound up keeping me for my own safety, which... well, I guess I can't blame them for. Between the needles and the children's clothes and the way I screamed with joy at the sight of my own hands and my hairy arms, I guess I must have really looked like a real loon. I didn't feel too bad being stuck in that place though, and they didn't keep me for long. They said something about spores in the lungs. I don't know. I don't even fucking care. I did tell them what happened, of course, but they just told me it was all the product of my mind. They say my head is fucked. I mean, they say it a little more politely than that, but that's the gist. It's fucked. They showed me a scan of my brain, and it looked like an apple after it had spent 3 weeks on the ground in mid-August. I guess I'm not an accountant anymore. Most days I'm lucky, if I can work a remote. I don't really care though. For a long time she kept leaving me a packed lunch on the doorstep of my new apartment. Fucking nuts, but I almost ate 1 or 2 of them. It was that strong of a habit, you know. But instead I always made a big show of throwing the food right in the bin. The last box was full of divorce paperwork, although it didn't look official. More like a bad joke, but that was the whole marriage, wasn't it? Just a bad joke. I signed them in crayon and left them outside. Every year, my family would get a family photo taken. We would always go to the same place, the local park. We then all stand in front of the large oak tree and pose for that year's family photo. Every year, we would always ask our close family friend, Terry, to take the photo. It was our one tradition that we would follow every year as a family. We followed this tradition for over 15 years. My family isn't really what you would call a close family. We all get along well enough, but we have always been too different from one another to ever have a really close bond. Despite this, though, the day we would take our family photo would be the one day of the year that I could feel a real sense of unity, and we really felt like a close family. My family consists of me, my mother, my father, my younger sister Samantha, and my older brother Jake. 5 of us in total. Me and my siblings always had an alright relationship growing up. We fought often, but we always found a way to forgive each other before starting our next argument. Over the years, however, we began to drift apart. I think as we got older, and got more responsibilities in life, we all found it too difficult to maintain our relationship with one another. Jake had a few kids and moved to a different state, and Samantha became a fairly successful lawyer, and so was always very busy. Both of my parents have since passed away as well, so in terms of family, I don't really have any now. When my parents passed away, they left everything to us 3 kids, and then we divided it up between each of us. Somehow, I ended up with all of the family photos that were taken throughout the years. Maybe I was missing my family, or maybe I was feeling nostalgic, but whatever it was, I decided that I wanted to look through the old family photos and reminisce on years gone by. I went up to the old desk that is sitting inside of the small study room and opened the top drawer. Inside, there was a large pile of old papers that I hadn't been through for many years. I searched through the old bills and the old letters, looking for the photos that I knew I had placed in this drawer. I had to search through all of the paper, and at the bottom of the drawer sat the small stack of photographs of me and family standing in front of the old oak tree. I gathered them up and closed the drawer before heading out of the study and sitting in the armchair that is in my lounge room. I looked down at the photograph that was on top of the pile. I remembered that years ago I had placed the photos in chronological order, and so the photograph on top, the earliest one taken. I was about 3 in the photograph. My parents were both standing behind me, and my brother Jake was next to me. Samantha was not yet born yet, so she didn't make an appearance in this edition of the family photo. I flicked through the photos, watching me and my brother grow older in each one, and then seeing my sister making an appearance in the 4th photo. I then saw both me and my siblings grow into older kids, then teenagers, and just as I was beginning to look like a man, the photos ended. I knew why the photos ended there. It wasn't because we were getting too old for it. I knew it was because my parents would no longer be able to be in them, and I don't think us kids felt right about taking the photos if our parents would be absent from them. I continued was looking at the last photo. I was looking at both of my parents in the images, looking back at their smiling faces. Smiling because they didn't yet know what would happen to the 2 of them. Then, something caught my eye. Behind the back of both my parents, between the branches of the old oak tree, a man was standing in the background, facing the camera and smiling. He was a very strange-looking man. He had long gray hair that hung around the side of his head, but he was balding on top. He was missing a number of teeth, and so his mouth was mostly a gaping black hole. His eyes, however, were probably the strangest thing. They almost appeared red, but that must have been because of the flash of the camera. I laughed a little bit to myself, thinking that we had been photobombed. I then finished flicking through all of the photos, and so was back at the beginning. I was about to put the photos back in the drawer, but that's when I saw it again. I saw him again. The same man, standing in the same spot behind my parents. The man looked the same age as he did in the previous photo, even though this one was many years earlier. He also had the same expression on his face, staring and smiling at the camera. His eyes were also the same shade of red as they were in the previous photo. I was a bit worried at this point. How could he appear in both photos that were taken 15 years apart? I then looked at the next photo, and standing behind the oak tree and behind my parents was the same man, looking exactly the same, his eyes still red. I then started to flick through each photo once again, and in each photo, in the same spot, stood this mysterious stranger. The more I looked, however, the more I began to think he wasn't smiling at the camera, but instead was laughing at my family standing there. I didn't know who this man was, and I didn't know why he was always standing between my parents and watching my family. I tried to think of different rational explanations. Maybe this man knew that we took a photo every year, and so planned to always be in the background of the photo. Or maybe, it was one of my parents' friends, playing a joke on us. I managed to convince myself that it was someone my parents knew, and they were just playing a joke. This helped comfort me enough and helped me try and forget what I had seen. I decided to turn on the television to further take my mind off of it. I switched it on and watched whatever was on for an hour or two, but that's when it happened. The words "breaking news" appeared, interrupting whatever sitcom I was watching. The newsreader began to speak and an image of a man I knew all too well appeared on the screen. "Terry Sturt, convicted murderer, has died today," the newsreader said, as the image of Terry, my parents' close friend and the photographer of all of our family photographs, appeared on the screen. He died in his cell, after a long battle with cancer. Terry was convicted back in 1996 of the murder of Edward and Teresa Barter, the newsreader continued, as a photo of my parents flashed up on the screen. Terry Sturt has always maintained that he was innocent, and today, in a deathbed confession, he revealed who he believes is responsible for the death of what Terry calls his closest friends. Terry claims that the man responsible is a man by the name of Paul Randling. However, 7 News can reveal that Paul Randling had long since been dead before the murders of Edward and Teresa Barter took place. The newsreader finished speaking, and the sitcom I was watching began to play once more. I couldn't get the man out of my head, though Paul Randling, my brain repeated over and over. I hadn't heard of the name before, but I had to know who it was. I pulled out my phone, and went open Google, and typed the name Paul Randling into the search bar, and then hit search. Most of the results were for Facebook profiles of people with that name. After a bit of searching, however, I managed to find an article with the name Paul Randling in it. I began to read. Murder, Paul Randling will face life in prison 25/1943. Paul Randling has today been sentenced for the hideous crime of a double murder. He has been convicted of murdering a young couple in cold blood. The couple's names cannot be revealed, but it is known that they have left behind 2 young children. Randling, 58, will be facing life in prison for his crimes, and will likely never see the outside of a jail cell ever again. Underneath the article was a small drawing of Randling, and it was unmistakable. This was the man in the photograph that was standing behind my parents. I didn't know what this meant. How could this man, that was jailed in the 1940s, be in the background of all of my family photographs? I decided to look at the photos once again, just to make sure it was the same person. I picked up the small stack of photos and looked at the one on top, but the man was no longer standing behind my parents. He had moved. I looked through all of the photos, and it was the same in all of them. He had moved from behind my parents. He was now standing right behind me. I vividly remember the day Duke disappeared. My family was spending the day at the lake next to our little bungalow, at a quaint property in northern Ontario. All 4 of us were swimming and splashing around in the warm lake water, attempting to quell the blistering August heat. Our only neighbor for miles, an old retired police officer named Benny, was smoking on his patio. I waved to him, and he waved back. We were in the dog days of summer, and I was glad to be in the water. Duke loved the water as much as I did and was still very energetic, being a large, middle-aged mutt. We would often throw frisbees and sticks off the dock, where he would take flying leaps into the blue-green lake. That's exactly what we were doing when he vanished. As I was drawing back my hand to throw the frisbee for Duke, I was anticipating a throw and getting ready to run, he suddenly whipped his head to the woods. I too looked back at the rows of towering hardwoods and conifers, scanning them to see what Duke was looking at. It was nothing, at least to me. It was a blur. Duke suddenly bolted for the trees, barking and snarling all while we were screaming his name. I screamed at my parents to get out of the water and help me chase him. I even saw Benny spring out of his rocking chair to help us. I ran as fast as my 9-year-old legs could carry me into the dense forest, twigs and debris snapping under my feet. But you can only get so far in flip-flops before you trip. I tumbled to the ground screaming and crying after accidentally scraping my leg against a sharp rock. My mom consoled me, while I caught a glimpse of my dad running through the woods. It was a while before my dad and Benny came back. My dad had a somber look on his face. He didn't have to tell us what we already knew, but Benny looked shaken. I'm sorry folks, but he ain't coming back, he said shakily. He took off his faded baseball cap respectfully and patted me on the shoulder before trudging up the hill back to his house. My whole family missed him, but to me, it felt like a part of me left when Duke did. He had been my best friend since I was young. And I even had a small photo album packed with pictures of the two of us, for a while. Every night before bed I would sift through the laminated pages of the photo album, reminiscing about good times and praying that someday he would come back to us. Deep down, I knew he wouldn't. A few months after Duke disappeared, my dad arrived home from work with a surprise. It was another dog. It wasn't elegant and athletic like Duke was. It was one of those tiny, white yappy ones with crusty red goop around its eyes. My parents fell in love with it. Princess, they called her. But I didn't. I simply referred to her as the dog. I was bitter. So bitter because I'd interpreted my dad's gesture of kindness as his own confirmation of Duke's absence. In time, I did grow to tolerate her. I had to admit, she was good company and it was cute when she curled up by my feet. Life was going normally for us until Duke came back. It had almost been a year since Duke had disappeared. On this particular day, we were all cooped up inside, courtesy of the rain. I was engulfed in my book when suddenly, I heard a bark. Not a high-pitched yap, but a deep, booming bark. I put down my book and rushed to the back door where I had heard it, Princess scuttling at my heels. When I peeked through the window, I nearly fell over. It was Duke, somehow. By this time, my parents had arrived. My mom rushed past me and whirled the door open, while my dad and I hung back, mouths agape. As my mom hugged Duke, I couldn't help but notice something off. I'd spent countless hours spending time with him and sleepless nights poring over photo albums. I'd familiarized myself with every spot, marking and quirk of Duke's fur. One of his most striking features was a black spot over his left eye which had appeared in almost every one of the photos. But standing here was Duke. His eye spot was now on his right eye. As a matter of fact, his whole pelt seemed to have been flipped. He was missing his collar, and he was skinnier than we'd last seen him, but it was him alright. Well, that's what I'd thought. The first red flag was how Princess reacted to Duke. She was a yappy dog alright. But when she saw Duke, she went ballistic, spitting and yapping like we'd never seen before. Princess barks at everything, remember? My dad told me, sensing my discomfort. She's probably just barking because he smells like the forest. And with that, he went outside to greet Duke. The barking must have alerted Benny, and he went outside to see what the commotion was. Once he saw what was going on, he darted back into his house and audibly slammed the door. When my parents came back inside, I tentatively stuck out a hand for Duke to sniff. He didn't wag his tail like I expected him to, all he did was quietly sit down. Then, he heard Princess yapping from the other side of the room. His head swiveled, and he lifted himself, and padded confidently towards her. Before long, he had her cornered. All he was doing was standing and watching her, yet Princess's eyes were bulging as she howled and yapped. A sense of dread was beginning to creep up my spine. But before anything happened, my dad whistled, and Duke lifted his head. With one last glance at Princess, he slunk away. The sense of wrongness didn't alleviate for the rest of the time Duke was with us. The second red flag was that Duke didn't eat the food we put out for him. Granted, it was food intended for small dogs, but it was still the same formula. Dogs are wired to eat everything they can get their paws on anyways. So even then it wouldn't have mattered. Not once did I see him eat. Every time we let him outside in the woods to relieve himself, he came back 20 minutes later, his white muzzle stained pink. I found it odd that my parents didn't think he was at risk of running away again, but since he didn't run, I never brought it up. They spent all their time with Duke, petting him, coddling him, attempting to feed him, and playing with him. All this while completely ignoring Princess, as well as my objections. Something's different about him, I brought up during dinner one day. That's nonsense. What are you talking about? Said my dad. He's good, old Duke. He looked at the dog as if searching for approval. We ate the rest of dinner in silence. As the summer went on, Duke seemed to gain more and more influence over my family. At this point, it was just me taking care of Princess. It was up to me to feed, walk and take care of her now, as my parents had completely neglected her. This dog wasn't the Duke I used to know. Every time he walked into the same room that Princess was in, she would scuttle away in fear and into my arms. I took to always being in the same room as Princess, just as a precaution. From what I didn't want to admit, but deep down, I think I knew. One day, Benny approached me while I was walking Princess. "You doing okay, kid?" Yeah, I trailed off. Benny bent down to meet my height, his friendly blue eyes clouded with concern. "Be careful, kid. If you need any help, I'm right up here." Without another word, he turned and walked back into his house. When I came back from the walk, my mom announced that we were going to this store. Dad had figured out that Duke liked raw meat. And we had run out of it. As a matter of fact, we had run out of all other food in the house. But of course, in order to enter the grocery store, we needed to leave the dogs alone. I wanted to stay home and look after Princess, but my mom wasn't having it. "I don't know why you always insist on being around that dog," said my mom. "It's not healthy." "Look who's talking," I muttered. "We're going to buy a bunch of raw meat for a dumb dog." For that, she slapped me. Tears sprung from my eyes. "Don't you dare speak about Duke that way," she huffed. "Get in the car." Without another word, I did as she said and got in, leaving Princess behind with the dog. I couldn't stop thinking about Princess as my parents cleared out the raw meat section. The drive home was nerve-wracking, and the walk up the driveway to our cottage was dreadful. I could hear the whimpering even before the door was open. Heart in my throat, I whirled the door open and screamed. Princess was under the kitchen table, leg bleeding profusely. No, it was gone. One of her legs was just gone. Curled up on the carpet was Duke, muzzle stained red. The rest of my family walked in. "Oh, the mess you've made. Bad dog," my mom said as she scolded Princess. She gave a pathetic whimper in response. This was my breaking point. "Stop," I wailed. "Are you guys blind? He tried to kill her. She needs to go to the vet." Yeah. Duke, I have a snack for you." His ears shot up as my dad ripped open a package of ground beef. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten all day, and the only food we bought was meat for Duke. I was livid. This damn dog was taking them over. I didn't feel safe anymore. "I'm leaving," I announced. "I'm taking Princess with me." Tears were streaming down my face, even as no one acknowledged me. I packed a few belongings and grabbed a towel to wrap Princess in. I remembered what Benny had said to me earlier that day, and I knew what I had to do. As I trudged down the dirt trail to Benny's house, thoughts collided into each other in my mind. Why were my parents ignoring me so much? Why didn't they care about Princess? Did they even love me anymore? The last one made me cry even harder. I reached the faded red door of Benny's house and knocked. He appeared a moment later, and when he saw me holding Princess with tears streaming down my face, his breath hitched. I knew this would happen, he muttered gravely under his breath. Get in my truck, kid. We'll go get your dog some help. He unlocked his truck, and without another word, I climbed silently into the back seat. I watched the cloud-dotted sky turn into pale shades of pink and purple as we sped down the bumpy road. After a while, we arrived at a small house which seemed to have been converted into a veterinarian clinic. Benny took Princess in his arms and rushed in, yelling for help. I followed along slowly and sat down in the waiting room, sad and defeated, but too tired to cry even more. After a lot of frantic pleading, Princess was to receive emergency care. A woman in a teal veterinarian's uniform carried her away. I sprang out of my seat. Let me go with her, I begged. Benny guided me away. She's gonna get help now, kid. It's in God's hands now. I plopped back down and curled into a ball. Benny patted me on the back. A somber silence had appeared between us, when I broke it by asking Benny something that I hadn't gotten the chance to before. Benny, what did you mean when you said that you knew this would happen? Benny, what did you mean when you said that you knew this would happen? He tensed up, a guarded look crossed his face, then one of guilt. He exhaled a melancholy sigh. Well, you see kid, you know why I live alone? He asked. I shook my head. Well, I had family too once. Marjorie. And my son, James. A sad look crossed his face. You remind me of him. We had a dog, too. A beautiful pointer, named Max. James loved him. So, he was all torn up when he went running away. But one day, about a year later, we find him standing at the front door. Something's wrong in those woods. It changed Max. He wouldn't eat the dog food we got him, only raw meat. James was happy to see him, but Marge was happier. I found it strange, because the night I'd brought Max home from the pound, she yelled at me like she never had before. And he chuckled wistfully to himself. Well, since I was busy patrolling all day and night, I didn't notice it as much as I should have. James kept missing school, and I noticed he was thinner. I told Marge that she had to take care of her son. But all she did all day was spend time with the dog. I tried to do the best I could, but I was a terrible dad and a terrible husband. I should have helped my wife. I should have protected James. He exhaled. I'm sorry, I said quietly, not knowing what else to say. Benny shook his head. I ain't finished yet. You see, one day, me and my partner get a call. Some neighbors had called about a disturbance at my address. My partner was in the driver's seat, and I was the first one to get out of the car. When I walked in the house, I saw my boy in the middle of the kitchen. Dead. The dog was eating him. Instinctively, I shot the dog. That's when Marge turned around with a knife. She lunged at me, and I shot the fatal blow. All 3 members of my family, dead in one night. My mouth was wide, and the full weight of his words weighed heavy on me. Was that to be the future of my family? Benny, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. I looked up at him to see a single tear trickling down on his otherwise stony expression. I failed James as a father. I can't do the same with you, kiddo. After his story was finished, I felt my eyelids start to droop. I leaned on Benny's arm. Good night, Benny. He was staring straight ahead, face emotionless. Good night. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how much my back hurt from sleeping on a chair all night. But I wasn't cold. Benny had put his tattered flannel jacket over me as a blanket. I sprang up from my chair and yelled at the receptionist. Where's Benny? She jumped in shock. He went to go do some errands. He said. She got up from her chair and picked up a few items. Take this, dearie, you must be starving. She placed a buttered bagel, a blueberry muffin, a banana and a bottle of apple juice on the table next to me. She was right, I was starving. Food always tastes the best after you've been deprived of it. I ran my fingers over my ribs. I could feel each one protruding from my chest. This was the first time I'd been full in ages. The receptionist had informed me that Princess had made it and that she was in the recovery stage. When I saw her for the first time, my heart exploded out of love for Princess and I hugged her gently. I smiled as she licked my face. I didn't know where else to go, so I played Scrabble with the receptionist for the rest of the day. I got to meet a fat cat named Mr. Cuddles, a rabbit named Twix, and I got to eat a hamburger for lunch. But all throughout the day, I kept wondering, when would Benny be back? At 3:04 p.m., my question was answered as Benny stumbled through the door. There was blood on his clothes. A couple of police cars were waiting outside. "Let's get going, kid." Although I didn't get the full story immediately, I came to know the full extent of what had happened eventually. Even though he wasn't part of the police force anymore, Benny still had connections with the department and to the people that know what happened to his family. He gathered police officers and went to my house, where they found Duke eating the carcasses of my parents. Then he shot him dead. I wept profusely for my parents, not for how they were to me in their final weeks, but for the people they once were. Benny assured me that they had loved me. There were not many people at the funeral, mostly townsfolk. Seeing as I didn't have any other relatives, the courts placed me in the custody of Benny after a lengthy court process. A few years later, he officially adopted me. Princess came to live with us too. Benny was proud of me when I went off to police college, when I got married, when my wife and I had a child. As per his wishes, we held him a small funeral. Life is generally good to me. I have a wonderful wife and an amazing daughter. Sometimes on the bad days in the dead of night, I thrash in my sleep as visions of dead dogs and screaming people ride in my nightmares. But when I wake, I look at my daughter sleeping in her cradle, and my wife hugs me back to sleep. I remember that everything is okay now. I grew up in a small community in the south of Minnesota called St. Gall. We were 8 families, all loosely related. Uncles and aunts from both sides of my family, along with grandparents and 2 outsider families not directly related by blood. It was a remnant of the hippie era, and my mother grew up out there. It was originally meant to be some sort of farming commune for people who wanted to live on their own terms without going completely off the grid. It isn't like a religious gathering or a cult, as many believe. It was all about a different way of life and living closer to the earth. My mother left St. Gall for a few years to study sociology. And that's where she met my dad. I was an accidental pregnancy, and my dad didn't want to stick around. My mother moved back to St. Gall and had me in the early 90s. I was born in the house I grew up in. Life out in St. Gall wasn't as odd as one might think. I still went to school, I just had to take an earlier bus. We still went into town at least once a week. And I had many friends that I got really close to over the years. Still, there was always that air of being different around me. My mom explained that a lot of the parents of the kids at school didn't like the people from St. Gall because we were different, a bit odd. My mom was terrified of a lot of things, but mostly blood. That was her #1 fear, and if I ever hurt myself she would try to cover it up as fast as possible. It was strange, because I saw kids skin their knees at school all the time without anyone freaking out. I never hurt myself like that, since my mom was adamant about me being needlessly careful. But my childhood came and went. Elementary school turned into middle school, which turned into high school. Things got rough then, fast. On the best of days I was a Gall kid, but most of the time they just called me Jesus freak, cultist, or even school shooter. I was branded an outsider without there ever really being a reason. I guess that's just what it's like being a teenager. I also refused to take the precautions my mother asked me to. Our teacher had a deal where kids could go to the gym instead of playing team sports, but I was tired of being separated. Compromise with my mom by wearing several layers of clothes, but I'd usually just wait for her to be out of sight before I took something off. If she ever knew I was pretty good at both soccer and basketball, she'd have a heart attack. It was during those few first PE classes that I started noticing something was different about me. Sure, we were all still growing up, but I was growing a bit different. I was almost completely hairless in comparison to the other boys, and my hair was growing lighter. I'd gone from brown hair to strawberry blonde in about 2 years. I would also start to notice a weird smell coming from the other boys. They really stank. It took me several weeks to notice that they weren't actually the ones who were different. They smelled like people were supposed to smell. My sweat, on the other hand, was sweeter. Not necessarily in a good way, but just weirdly sweet by comparison. Not sugary, but more like the smell of thick dairy. I hadn't thought about it, I just figured that was the way sweat was supposed to smell. It wasn't. I'd made one friend in high school, Darren, short guy who dropped in and out of social cliques like it was his job. I talked to him about it and asked him to smell me. Weird, I know, and he agreed that something was off. He convinced me to talk to the school nurse, thinking it might be something like diabetes. I was scared he'd tell someone about it, but he never did. Good guy. I had a long chat with the school nurse, Anita. She was very reassuring. Apparently, puberty can have all sorts of weird effects on the human body. A sweet smell coming from your sweat was hardly the worst she'd seen, or in this case, smelled. It was weird. Sure, but this was a weird time to be a human. Still, she decided to run a few blood tests just to make sure my iron levels and white blood cells were okay. As soon as she poked the needle through my arm, she recoiled and crinkled her nose. The syringe dropped to the floor, and I got up. She got a tissue and started to blow her nose repeatedly, over and over. "What the hell was that?" she exclaimed. "What did you?" I had no idea what she was talking about. I looked at the drop of blood poking out of my arm, and I didn't notice anything odd. I just put a band-aid on it, while Anita tried to regain her composure. Come back tomorrow," she coughed. "We'll talk more, okay?" But she was sick the next day. I felt uncomfortable with the whole thing, and I wanted to talk to my mom about it. But I also didn't want her to get worried. When you have someone in your life that is always on the breaking point, you make a habit out of stepping carefully. It took Nurse Anita the rest of the school week before she returned to her job. I was immediately summoned to the nurse's office. She'd lost weight. A lot of it. She was drinking water from a large bottle when I got there. And she had dark markings around her eyes. She didn't seem well, but she lit up as she looked at me. Anita asked me for a new blood test, and I agreed. She lined up 4 syringes. Her hands were shaking, but she regained her focus once the needle got closer to my arm. Step by step she filled the syringes, but she seemed to get more and more excited as she did. I can swear she was sniffing my neck. The whole thing was weird, and I left as soon as she gave me a band-aid. She promised to run some tests, and let me know as soon as she was done, but she wanted me to return at least once a week for a checkup. Apparently, sweet-smelling sweat was a bigger deal than I'd anticipated. I asked her if I should see a doctor, but she just shook her head. As I left the nurse's office, I looked back. She was standing in the doorway, staring at me from across the hall. Her eyes never left me. She was staring at my neck, drinking from her water bottle. This time, I told my mother. I had no idea how much she would overreact. Instead of talking to Nurse Anita, she pulled me out of school the same day. She threw our entire lives into boxes, breaking at least half of our dinnerware in the process. In less than a weekend she packed up everything and hired a truck. I barely had the time to hug my grandparents goodbye before we were out of town. I was forced to switch phone number, and my mother swore that if I didn't remove my social media accounts she'd smash every touchscreen we owned. I'd never seen her like that before. I was terrified. That's how we ended up in Sabre, Michigan. Of course, my mom couldn't check on me all day long. I did get time to check in on my social media. Darren, still in disbelief about me leaving so soon, told me things had gotten weird at school. I did get time to check in on my social media. Darren, still in disbelief about me leaving so soon, told me things had gotten weird at school. Nurse Anita had started asking questions about where I'd moved, and when the principal couldn't reveal that information she'd gotten aggressive. The police got involved, and it was revealed that she'd taken my blood samples home. Things got unclear at this point, but Darren, whose mom works at the sheriff's office, had spoken over dinner about Nurse Anita apparently drinking blood straight from the syringes. But that wasn't all. In the days that followed, she was taken into custody. She was doing some sort of hunger strike and couldn't even keep down water. She actually died from dehydration, right there in the county jail, surrounded by paramedics trying to understand why her body was actively resisting an IV. By now, my mom and I had settled in at a small 3-bedroom apartment. I confronted her about Nurse Anita and what had happened. My mom finally opened up to me. "You know what capsaicin is?" she asked. "It is the thing in spicy food that makes your tongue and throat hurt. It is a kind of self-defense thing that just is supposed to make us stay away." I'd heard about it, and I was aware of the concept. "This thing that is supposed to make us stay away just makes it more enticing," she explained. "People can get addicted to it. To many, it has the opposite of the intended effect. It became something to be desired instead of something that protects the plant. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I sort of was. I didn't want to think I was, but I was. "Our family is different," she told me. "I was hoping this wouldn't happen to you, but it did, and we had to move." She really did try to bring me a normal life. She tried not to worry, but whatever is inside me was growing extremely potent. I started to understand why our family had lived isolated, and why she wanted me to be careful around the others. As a kid, it wasn't as dangerous, but as a teenager it was stronger than ever. That's why even I was noticing my own smells. They'd gotten stronger. But the years passed. My mom got a job at a gas station, and I helped out as a farmhand and cherry picker. Things were going pretty well, all things considered, until last year. I was picking up my mom from the night shift early in the morning when a truck on the opposite lane ran a red light. We were hit. It wasn't a bad hit, but it was bad enough to send us into a spin and into a nearby ditch. Mom had been looking through her purse and smashed her head against the passenger window. And I had bashed the steering wheel. The passenger side of the rear half of the car was folded like origami. I barely even remember what happened next. I remember the truck driver coming to check on Mom, only to drag her out on the pavement. I remember paramedics in the police car. I remember eyes looking at me, delirious and dark. Open, bloody mouths. Tendons snapping. A sweet, flowery smell drowning out the gasoline pouring from the car. Red. I remember seeing a half-eaten face, slowly being torn apart. Eyes that used to comfort me having lost their light. A slack-jawed nightmare, having clothes and limbs torn apart, and splayed on the concrete like a flattened toad. I don't remember much about getting away. I was chased through a field of wheat, and threw up in a water bucket next to a well. I hid in a barn, and covered myself in hay, to dampen the smell of my blood. I remember a flashlight passing over me as 3 people left, desperately looking somewhere else. Bloody mouths, still chewing. Pupils so large their eyes looked black. They were barely even breathing, their breaths so short I couldn't see their chests move. I made it. I would never speak of this in person, as I don't want to risk anyone finding me. I've moved twice since that incident, and I'm starting to understand what I am. The problem is, I've started to get cataracts. I know, it is at an early stage, but it is definitely there, and it is progressing rapidly. I'm going to need surgery. Someone has to operate on me, and I fear I'll never wake up from that surgery. I have no idea what to do. I can't live like this, constantly fearing someone will get too close, and catch a whiff of me. No wonder my mom had to leave my dad. No wonder she was always afraid. You're all hunting me. You just don't know it yet. I guess there's no point beating around the bush, so I'm just gonna get straight to it. There's a dead body in my basement. No, I'm not kidding. It's the god honest truth. And here's the thing, it's been there for over a week now. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, dude, that's fucked up. And you're right, it is. But I can assure you, there's a perfectly valid reason for why it's still there. I'll explain why in a minute, but let me fill you in on the details first. About a week ago I was taking some dirty laundry down to the basement. I walked down the stairs, and made my way over to the light switch on the other side, and discovered that there was a guy dressed in a suit and tie, lying on his back in the middle of the floor. His hands were folded together, like he was praying, and he had a big knife sticking out of his chest. To say that I was gobsmacked would be the fricking understatement of this century. I couldn't move. I just stood there completely frozen, staring at the guy like a deer trapped in oncoming headlights. The first semi-coherent thought that passed through my brain about 20 seconds later was that it had to be a practical joke. That some of my asshole friends would come running out any second with a camera and big grins, screaming gotcha dumbasses. And I wished that had happened, but no such luck. There was no one else there. It was just me and Mr. Mysterious Dead Guy. And that's when the enormity of it finally hit me, and I nearly passed out. And can you really blame me? There I was, in my own basement, thinking everything is fine and dandy, and wham fricking bam, I stumble across a dead body. So a couple of minutes goes by, and I'm slowly starting to come out of the daze I'm in, and working up the necessary courage to go over there for a closer look. But as I approach the guy I have second thoughts, so I stop, turn around and grab a hammer from the tool shop behind this staircase. Don't ask me why, but that's what I did. Then I go back to the body. And that's when I see that his eyes are open, and my heart skips a beat. It's creepy enough having a dead body in your basement, but it's even creepier having a dead body with its eyes open. Anyway, I walk a little closer and I see the bluest eyes I've ever seen in my life. It's almost like they're made out of polished ice. And they're staring straight up at the ceiling, like the owner has just seen a goddamn ghost up there. So I stand where I am for a few minutes, wondering what the hell do I do now? And then all of a sudden I decide to check if he's got any ID on him. I mean, that's what they do on TV, right? Figure out who the victim is and all that shit. So I take a few deep breaths and kneel down next to the guy and start going through his pockets. I'm careful not to touch him, which is actually fairly easy if you take your time. Then about a minute into the search, I finally find what I'm looking for, a wallet. And that's when all fucking hell breaks loose. As I'm going through the content of his wallet, the light goes out, and I'm cast into complete darkness. I mean, I can't even see an inch in front of me. All I manage to say is Jesus Christ, and then a cold hand locks itself around my wrist and starts to squeeze. If you've ever been truly scared, and I mean really fucking scared, then you can multiply your experience by 10 and you know how I felt. And yeah, you guessed it, I wet my pants. There was nothing I could do to stop it. It just came pouring out like water from a goddamn garden hose. Then I sucked in a couple of gallons of air and nearly passed out. So there I was, my heart was doing somersaults inside my chest, and I could feel the taste of blood and sulfur in my mouth, and last but not least, I had a dead cold hand wrapped around my wrist. I tried to jump up on my feet, but the hand was holding me tight and didn't seat a millimeter. There was no way I was going to be able to stand up. Then wham, another hand locks onto my arm, just above where the other one is. And that's when I started screaming from the top of my lungs. I was like a wild animal. I was kicking and screaming, hitting the hands, trying to extricate myself. But it was no use, it was like my arm was stuck in a vice. Then the hands try to pull me closer, and I go fucking mental. I throw myself backwards, and kick the guy repeatedly, trying desperately to break free. I throw my arm behind me hoping to find something I can grab onto, and that's when my hand bumps into the hammer. I hit it with such force, that I should be withering in pain. But the adrenaline numbed the sensation, and I was able to ignore it. At that point, I could probably have taken a few sucker punches straight to the head and still kept going. So I finally realize what it is, and after fumbling around for it with my hand for a second or two, I manage to get hold of it. And then something inside me takes over, and I go straight to autopilot mode. My arm starts swinging with full force, and the hammer keeps striking the guy repeatedly. It was like an out-of-body experience. Like witnessing a psycho bashing the shit out of someone on TV and not really caring one iota about what happened to the victim. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I probably kept at it for a good minute, then I noticed that the guy's hands had relinquished their grip on my arm. So I jump up and bolt across the room and manage to run straight into the wall, and almost knock myself out cold. But I remain conscious. Then I race over to the stairs and run up to the kitchen, where I throw myself into a corner and assume the fetal position. Well, actually, I pushed a heavy cabinet up against the door leading down to the basement first, just to be on the safe side. So I sit there for almost half an hour, hyperventilating and sweating bullets until I'm finally able to think coherent thoughts again. Then I grab a torch and a new bulb, and I return to the basement. The hand holding the torch is shaking like a vibrator, but I'm able to hold on to it. The first thing I do is to shine the light on the guy's face just to make sure he's still there. He is. His face looks like an overinflated punching bowl. It's covered in blood, mucus and bruises. Then I grab a stepladder and change the light bulb, and approach the guy for a second inspection. And this time I make sure I stay half a dozen feet away. And that's when I notice it. His hands are in exactly the same position as they were when I first saw him. They're folded together on top of his chest. It's like he never moved them, and never grabbed my arm. I shake my head in disbelief and blink a few times, thinking my eyes are doing a trick on me, but they're not. His hands really are folded together, which means he must have folded them while I was bashing him with the hammer, or someone else latched onto my arm. The thought scares the shit out of me, and I quickly snatch the hammer off the floor and raise it above my head. Then I start going through every inch of the basement. I make sure to take my time, and I do a thorough search. But the basement is empty. It's just the two of us down there. So I go back upstairs again, and that's when I realize what a terrible predicament I have managed to get myself into. If I call the cops, they'll automatically assume that I killed the guy, and I'll get locked up for life. And if there is one place I don't want to go to, it's the penitentiary, or as the folks around these parts jokingly refer to it, the penitentiary. Guys like me, is only 5 feet 10 and weighs in just shy of 150 pounds, generally don't have a good time in places like that if you get my drift. And that's when I realize I have to get rid of the body. That's the only way, and that's where I'm at now. It's been exactly 1 week since I punched the guy's ticket. There has been no mention of him in the media, so I guess he wasn't that popular, and thank God for that. I don't think I could put on a straight face if the cops came knocking on my door. I'm not going to lie, the last week has been pure hell. The memory of the ordeal never leaves me. It's like a dripping faucet. It doesn't matter how hard I turn the tap, I just can't stop it. But I think I've managed to deal with it pretty well. I don't think I've given anyone a reason to suspect that I've recently bashed someone to death with a carpenter's hammer. I've also reached a decision as to how I'm going to solve this problem, although it's not something I'm looking forward to. But hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? I've been down to the local hardware store and acquired 2 new handsaws, some heavy-duty bin liners, duct tape and a hazmat suit. Items that will come in handy for what I've got planned. It will probably take me all night, but I don't think I'll run into any major problems. All I can say is thank God that it is winter, and that the temperatures are in the low 20s. Everything should be frozen solid by now, so there won't be that much of a mess to clean up afterwards. I've also done a few online searches, and I've got a good idea of how to dispose of the various evidence. But that's not something I'm going to share with you. That's a secret that I'll take to my grave. Well, I think that about covers it. Please wish me luck. If everything goes according to plan, I might just be able to get away with it, and with time, put this entire mess behind me. If not, I'll guess you'll see my face in the papers and on TV before you know it. How will you recognize me, if it comes to that? Well, that's a pretty easy question to answer. I'll be the little white guy looking straight into the camera, protesting my innocence. When I was little, I almost drowned. I was staying for a few days with my grandmother Agatha. All of her 7 grandchildren were expected to visit during the summer months, and at the time, I was no different. She was a distant woman that seemed to hide some kind of poisonous anger behind a thin veneer of cold courtesy, and even as a young girl I often wondered why she wanted to occupy her summers with a rotation of children she seemed to care about very little. None of our parents seemed to question it though, whether due to love or duty or fear or the simple fact that Agatha was very, very rich. So when, at 7, a man stepped from the woods, my first thought was that he was a gardener. He wore a dark gray suit and white gloves, but I had seen a maid and butler in the house for years, and they both dressed up fancy too, so in my child's mind, it wasn't unreasonable that my grandmother would make people wear a suit to work outside as well. I was playing at the edge of the backyard garden. One of the advantages of my grandmother's perpetual disinterest was that I pretty much did what I wanted without supervision when I visited on my own, and, after glancing up at the man's arrival, and giving him a nervous smile, I turned back to look at whatever it was I'd been doing. It was then that I saw it out of the corner of my eye. The man was running for me. I had time to look up and take in more detail of the man as he lurched toward me with outstretched hands. Time to see how gray his skin was in the daylight, and how his mouth hung open like the entrance to a flesh cave of black gums and broken teeth. A chance to see how large his eyes were, nearly all whites except for small rings of blue iris wrapped around pinpricks of black. Enough opportunity to suck in a breath to scream, only to find the air forced out in a soundless whoosh as he reached me and yanked me backward onto the ground. I was terrified, of course, my mind already flooding with vague abstract versions of all the terrible things that could happen if a stranger got you. I tried to struggle, but it was little use. He had a fistful of my hair, and was far stronger than me, dragging me with ease toward the center of the yard where a large reflecting pool sat waiting. My mouth was ready to try another scream when we hit the water. The shock of the cold stunned me for a moment, and before I could recover, he was forcing my head beneath the surface. I struggled again, harder this time, some dark corner of my brain kicking into gear at the threat of, not just future dangers, but immediate death. It still didn't matter. I never even got my head above water, and it wasn't long before the world began to darken as my mind narrowed down to a thin sliver of consciousness. It was as that last strand of desperate, terrified thought was about to break, that the man's hands were suddenly gone, and I felt my body lurch up in a desperate search for air. It took a couple of minutes of me laying next to the pool retching and crying, before I could even stand to go look for help. There was no sign of the man anywhere, not even wet footprints, where he might have run off, but I was horrified at the thought that he might reappear at any moment. I crawled to the edge of the back patio as I caught my breath, and when I did manage to stand up, I ran inside, and found my grandmother, hugging her and weeping as I tried to explain what had happened. She was less than impressed. She told me I shouldn't make up fanciful tales to excuse playing in the water, which had dirtied my clothes and no doubt left a trail of dirt and wet throughout her house, as well as on her. Face stern, she pried me away and held me at arm's length, studying me for a moment. You don't seem the worse for wear. Go clean up and change your clothes. Lunch will be in 15 minutes. I did go and change, but not until I had snuck and called my mother to come get me. She was reluctant at first, but when she heard how upset I was and what I was saying, she told me her and my father would be there by the afternoon. They came as promised, and what followed was an hour of heated argument between them and my grandmother, followed by my parents taking me home. After that, I never went back to visit my grandmother again, and as I got older, I came to understand that, for all intents and purposes, Agatha no longer considered us part of her family. So I was surprised that, 2 months after her death, I got a letter from my grandmother's attorney asking me to arrange a time to come in to discuss my inheritance. I almost didn't go at all while I could use the money. I knew she had cut my parents out of her will, and I had nothing but bad memories associated with the woman myself. I talked to my mother about it, and she encouraged me to go. Said that whatever her mother had been, she was gone now, and I shouldn't pass up the opportunity to get whatever it was just because of bad childhood memories. Maybe, my mother said, this was Agatha's way of trying to make up for what happened years before. The next week I was sitting alone in a large wood-paneled conference room in the lawyer's office, staring at 2 envelopes. The attorney had pointed out the writing on the front of each, saying that, as my grandmother had indicated, if I chose to open the envelopes, I should start with the one on the left, and then follow with the one on the right. I'd given him a funny look at that, asking why it mattered. He only shrugged, saying that it was Agatha's wish, and he asked if I'd buy it. By the time he had left, I'd already decided I was opening the right one first, if for no other reason than well fuck Agatha. She was a weird controlling bitch even from the grave. Or was trying to be. Smirking at the thought and feeling a kind of happy anger bubbling in my chest, I grabbed up the right envelope, and went to tear it open, but the paper didn't budge. It was nice thick paper, but I saw no reason I shouldn't be able to rip it. Grimacing, I tried again with no luck. I looked at the edge of where it had been sealed shut, thinking I could pry it open there with a fingernail, but when that didn't work either, I tossed the envelope back down and stared at it. There was definitely something inside it. Something with a bit of weight to it that slid around. A key maybe. The paper was too thick to tell. Too thick and apparently made of Kevlar. Sighing, I looked at the other envelope. It read, "Open this envelope first." And just seeing the delicate loops of my grandmother's handwriting made my stomach clench a little. I considered going and asking for a pair of scissors, or something to get the right envelope open, but I decided against it. I was being petty, and dragging this whole thing out way more than it needed to be. Better to try the other one, and then go from there, if it was any easier to open. If it wasn't, I'd go borrow Bloaterch or something. The left envelope opened easily, however, and inside I found a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, lined with more of Agatha's writing. Despite the truncated nature of our relationship and the unreasonable behavior of your parents, I am bequeathing to you something of great worth. In truth, out of all that I have, it is of the greatest value to me, and perhaps in time, to you. I call it Birdie. Birdie the cat. This may seem a childish name to you, and it is, but I first acquired Birdie when I was a young woman that still possessed a whimsical sense of humor, not yet hardened and sharpened by the stony truths of the world. He does not require much from you other than the following 3 things. First, your companionship. He will always be with you. Second, once a year, he will ask you for a name. It must be someone who you have personally met and that is alive, but those are the only requirements. Third, a week after you give him a name, he will grant you a wish. There are certain limitations on this, but Birdie is capable of doing miraculous things. If you abide by these 3 rules, you will find your time with Birdie very pleasant and profitable. Enjoy. Your grandmother, Agatha Dance. P.S. You may now open the other envelope. I stared at the letter for a moment and then reread it. Was it some kind of weird practical joke, or had she gone senile before the end? I glanced back at the other envelope. Maybe this was some odd prank where the other envelope had a key in it to her house or to a storage unit filled with cat litter. Either way, it all seemed really out of character for my grandmother, or at least my idea of who she had been. I stopped at that thought. The truth was, I had no idea who she really was. My memories of her weren't positive, and the stories I'd heard from my parents weren't much different or better, but all of that was also tainted by the fear and anger of what had happened when I was a child and her reaction to it. Maybe there was more to her than that small window from the past. Maybe she was a quirky woman isolated by her success and hamstrung by personality flaws. Maybe by the end she was sorry for how things had gone, and this really was her way of trying to make up for it. Shaking my head, I pulled out my phone and tried to call my mother. This was all so weird, and I wasn't sure I wanted to even open the other envelope, money or no money. The phone just rang and then went to voicemail, so I hung up. Frowning down at the right envelope, I let out a sigh. I'd try to open it one more time. If I couldn't, I'd carry it outside. The lawyer or somebody could open it for me, and I'd finally find out what the punchline to all this really was. This time the envelope opened easily. My heart hammering, I tipped it, catching the heavy thing inside as it slid out into my palm. As it landed there, I let out a hiss and let it drop to the table with a clatter. Looking back to my hand, I saw a small dot of blood, and when I glanced back to the thing on the table, I understood why. It was a small, flat oval of metal, ornately carved with symbols winding around 3 tiny, but sharp-looking bumps protruding from each side. One of those stubby needles had been what had poked me, and I had a moment of panic, thoughts ranging from tetanus to poison-tipped booby traps. But no, I was being silly. It was looking more and more like my grandmother had just been crazy when she died, and whatever this was, it seemed harmless enough aside from being sharp. Wondering why it hadn't torn or poked through the envelope, I looked inside to find a second letter that had been bundled with a piece of metal. Congratulations. Birdie is yours now. The object bundled with this note is very special. In some circles it is known as a staring eye. In others, a tumor. For you, it is a symbol of your bond with Birdie, and like Birdie, it will always be with you. Do not attempt to rid yourself of it. It will always come back to you. Do not fail to abide by the rules outlined in the other letter. If you do as I say, you will have a good life. If you do not, Birdie will become angry. We humans do not understand true anger, or true despair. But you will find an angry Birdie to be a very good teacher. I'm curious what you will do. If you are like your worthless parents, you will see it as a curse. If you have some of my strength, however, you may find yourself thanking me for the greatest gift you've ever received. Time will tell. I'll say goodbye with this last bit of advice and a small secret between grandmother and granddaughter. Remember that others cannot see Birdie. Often you won't either. But he sees you. He always see you. As for the secret, I didn't pick you for this. He did. 15 minutes later I was back in my car. I tried questioning the lawyer about the letters and the metal eye, but he wouldn't say anything other than that he had been explicitly told by Agatha to let the inheritance speak for itself. When I asked about Birdie, he paled slightly and told me he had a meeting he was late for, but that he certainly hoped I had a good rest of my day. It was as I was driving out of the parking lot that my phone began to ring. Hey, honey. I've been trying to get you after I saw I missed your call. Everything okay? Yeah, I think so. I just left the lawyer's office from the inheritance thing. It was super weird. Weird how? What did they give you? A couple of letters and some metal thing. The letters were really odd. Like, did Grandma ever have a cat named Birdie? There was a pause and then, did you say a cat? No. She never had any pets when we were growing up, or later on either. And, I mean, I can't say what she had or didn't have in the last 20 years, but I'm pretty positive it wouldn't be a cat either way. Why? Your grandmother, she was always a very strong woman. Cold and hard to know, yes, but I can't deny that she was very strong-willed and determined. Fearless at least most of the time. The one thing that terrified her was a cat. I think it was from something that happened to her as a child, but I can tell you that she hated them for as long as I knew her. Hated them because they were the only thing she was actually scared of. When I finished talking to my mother, I was no closer to understanding what I'd been given, and why then when I started. She didn't know what a staring eye or tumrin was, although she admitted most Agatha's beliefs and interests were mysteries to her far before our family split in two. She suggested I get the piece of metal appraised to see if it was somehow valuable, before throwing it away. I almost argued against the idea by pointing out it was probably just a piece of junk from a crazy old woman, but something stopped me before I began. I think it was the wounded sound in my mother's voice at having to talk about the dead woman at all, at having to remember how things had been left between them, and speculated what had become of Agatha over the last decades of her life. I don't think my mother regretted cutting us off from her, but I'm old enough now to understand that even the right choice can hurt sometimes. So I let it go, and I came home, and put the envelopes in a drawer. I spent a few minutes looking online for reputable appraisers, but before long I was too sleepy to do anything but sink into my pillow in the swallowing dark. I woke up a few hours later when something climbed up onto my bed. Sitting up, I blinked blearily in the darkness, heart pounding. Maybe it had just been a dream, like when you wake up while you think you're full. There was a man sitting at the foot of my bed. I let out a gasp as I pulled my legs in and sat up further. Who are you? What are you doing here? The man just stared at me, smiling, and I stared back, transfixed by my fear and the realization that, in the silver light of the moon, I recognized him. Remembered him. His gray suit and matching skin. His boiled egg eyes and drooping, jagged bone mouth. Ghost white gloves covering the long-fingered, strong hands that had dragged me by the hair, and held my face underwater until I almost drowned. The man from my memories and my nightmares. The thing that, in all of my life, I feared the most. I recognized him, but more importantly, I knew who he was. Voice trembling, I breathed out the question like an offering. Birdie. The man's bony shoulders shook with a deep, rumbling chuckle as his boneless lips twitched and stretched into an obscene impression of a smile. My grandfather served in the Vietnam War. I was always fascinated about his time in the service, but my mother had instructed me not to ask him about it from a young age. I never did, but he would bring up little bits and pieces now and then. It wasn't often, though. My grandfather was a kind, yet strict, man. My grandma told me that he was a very laid-back and calm man before the war. But afterwards, he became the old, hardened man that I knew growing up. I distinctly remember playing with military toys as a kid, and he just walked in and shook his head, saying, "It wasn't like that, kid." What I'm trying to say is that, although I love my grandfather, he can be a cold man sometimes. I don't blame him. I didn't see the horrors that he saw. Time has taken its toll on my grandfather, though. And all his years of smoking have caught up with him. For the last few weeks he's been in a hospital on his deathbed. The cancer has spread from his lungs to the rest of his body. I've been spending a lot of time beside his bed, just keeping him company or watching TV with him. Recently, likely because he knows that his time is coming sooner than later, he has been telling stories. Some have been about his childhood, raising my mother, old school friends, while others, and more importantly, have been about his time in Vietnam. The stories started off small, with him first telling me about some of his friends that he served with. As time went on, though, he opened up more and more. He started telling me about the things that he did and saw. He told me about the napalm attacks in the jungle. How he and his squad were right on the outside of the clear zone when it hit. They watched the planes drop it, setting ablaze the jungle, and, in turn, everyone inside. He said he heard the screams of those burning alive. Gut-wrenching, horrible screams of pure agony. Sounded like hell in our world, he said before stating. I suppose it was. As if the sounds weren't enough, one of the victims came running out of the inferno. Like a ball of fire with arms and legs, my grandfather told me. He said after a few dozen yards, he just fell on the ground screaming. My grandfather and a war friend of his walked over to the burning body, to see it struggling to extinguish the flames on the ground. My grandfather looked away from my eyes at this part of the story. It was just a fucking kid, he sighed. Fucking kid with his flesh melting off his damn bones. He took a deep breath. We couldn't just leave him there like that, so I took out my gun and put the poor bastard out of his misery. I knew that these stories were causing him distress, bringing back memories that he likely had tried to forget for years. I told him that he didn't have to talk about any of this if he didn't want to, but he insisted, saying that wasn't even the worst thing that I saw. It was the middle of the day. My grandfather and his squad were walking through the jungle. He said they were doing their usual thing when his sergeant put his hand up for all them to stop and stay quiet. This happens sometimes, he said. Sergeant would think he heard something and we'd have to shut up. Saved our lives a few times, I suppose. Other times. He trailed off. They all sat and listened for a minute when my grandfather noticed something. Nothing in the jungle was making a sound. No wildlife, no bugs, not even the swing of leaves in the wind. Nothing. He tightened his grip on his gun as he looked around, his eyes darting from treetops to the ground searching for the enemy. It was then that he noticed something. That jungle was always fucking hot. You were never not sweating your ass off, even if you were just standing there, he said. But then, for that one time, it was cold. Ice cold. In just a second I could see my breath fog up as it left my mouth. My grandpa turned to see his squad mates all looking around in amazement as well as they all watched the wisps of their breath fog up in the air. They sat there, frozen in shock at what they were witnessing, when a fellow squad mate right behind him jerked to look around, all of a sudden. Clearly started by something he heard in the jungle. Tharp, the soldier, and I were buddies. We had seen a lot of shit together in the war, so I knew he was usually level-headed, even under fire, my grandpa clarified. But we could see from the look on his face, that whatever he had heard, had spooked him real bad. Then, out of nowhere, he called out into the jungle, "Jill." Grandpa said he had instantly clapped his hands over Tharp's mouth to shut him up. The soldier struggled against my grandpa to try and break free, as the rest of his squad got ready for the inevitable firefight that was sure to come after. Tharp had given up their location by yelling. Wait, I interrupted my grandpa's tale. Was Jill another soldier? Jill was Tharp's girlfriend back home, Grandpa said coldly. Even with my hand over his mouth, he kept trying to call for Jill, over and over again. I kept whispering to him, Tharp, you gotta calm down, Jill's not here, you're gonna get us all killed, but he just kept struggling. That was when another one called out, this time calling for his mom. No one was there to stop the other soldier like my grandpa had Tharp, allowing the soldier to run straight into the jungle, calling out to his mother. Tharp was fighting to break free, tears now rolling down his eyes as he struggled to break free. My grandpa held his ground, though, doing his best to keep the soldier pinned. However, my grandpa was distracted as another soldier ran into the jungle, calling after someone they knew from home, someone who had no right to be in the jungles of Vietnam. Tharp used the distraction to get out his knife and stab my grandfather in the leg. I screamed as Tharp broke free and ran out into the jungle, calling out for Jill. One by one the squad broke down and ran into the jungle, all the while the temperature seemed to be getting colder and colder. The whole time soldiers were running into the jungle for someone they heard calling for them. My grandfather heard nothing, nor did seemingly any of the other men until they too ran out of the clearing after a loved one. Eventually, there was only my grandpa and one other soldier, back to back. Guns drawn and at the ready as their breath fogged up into the now cold jungle air. After a moment of silence, screams of the rogue squad mates filled the jungle air all around them. Some sounded far away while others seemed to be coming from right next to them. They sounded even more piercing given the silence that had momentarily fallen upon the area. Then, it happened for my grandfather. "Your grandma," I heard her voice, like she was right next to me, whispering into my left ear. His lip was quivering. I turned to look at her, when I saw this thing through the trees. It wasn't close to me like it sounded. No, it was a good 30 feet or so back into the clearing. My grandfather paused, so I asked him, what was it? He let out a laugh. "Fuck if I know. It sure as hell wasn't Charlie, that's for damn sure. It looked..." He pondered with how he wanted to describe it before saying, "It looked like how radio static sounds. Like I couldn't make out what I was seeing, because my eyes were getting a bad signal. I could tell it was big though. Real fucking big. Looked like a shadow too." He added, "I could see that it was ripping one of our guys apart, sending the camo legs of one of my squad mates hurtling into the jungle. I didn't watch to see what it did to the top half of the guy. I don't know if the other guys that ran towards that thing had seen it, or had just heard a voice and ran that direction in a panic, but whatever the reason, I didn't go after it. I was mortified. I grabbed the guy behind me and started dragging him back in the general direction of our base. He figured out what I saw doing and screamed at me. Said he wasn't going to leave his soldiers behind." Grandpa paused and reached over to his nightstand to grab a glass of water with a trembling hand. He took a long drink before continuing. "I told him it was a suicide mission, that he hadn't seen the thing in the trees and what it would do to him, but he didn't care. He said we left no man behind and ran into the trees towards the screams of our friends. I continued my way back to base. It wasn't long until I heard gunshots. Then screaming. Then nothing." I sat in silence as my mind digested my grandfather's story. "So what happened next?" I asked. "I made it back to base. I tried telling my superiors what happened, but they figured I was just some scared kid who had seen his squad massacred in front of him. They weren't wrong about that, but I know it wasn't men or bullets that killed them. I know what the fuck I saw." My grandfather passed away about 2 weeks after he told me that story. Truth be told, I don't know what to think about his story. I figured I'd share it here, let you make your assumptions. But my grandpa was never delusional. Even near the end. And, although it sounds impossible, I saw the terror in his eyes as he talked about that thing. There was no way anyone would have been able to be that afraid of something that didn't happen. Are you bored? Are you lonely and bored? Do you have a lot of time on your hands? Do you have hands? I'm offering you a proposal, with potential financial compensation for your troubles. It may sound off-putting at first blush, but hear me out. I am looking for a human host. And I mean a willing human host who might be willing to give up some of their time to help out an odd fellow that doesn't have hands or blood. Am I asking to control your body? Yes. Sometimes. You'll still be there, but taking the back seat. Now you're probably thinking, that sounds no fun. I don't want to spend all my time riding shotgun. And that's valid. But you all spend about half of the day unconscious anyway. Your body is just there, doing nothing, a complete waste. As for me, I don't sleep, so we could have it, so that during the day, I will graciously let you do fun human things, and at night, I'll do whatever. And by whatever, I mean perfectly safe, perfectly reasonable activities. I don't drink, and I rarely go outside. I enjoy baking, I look at pictures of birds online. I've been getting into neuroscience lately. Very interesting stuff. You're all very interesting. And maybe you're still thinking, hey now, I don't want some random mind-controlling thingy hauling my body around in my sleep, Weekend at Bernie's style, to which I say, you're no fun, and you're not the kind of person I want to live with anyway. But I'm a light sleeper, you say. Don't worry. I can isolate your somatosensory cortex, so you can't feel anything. But my family will think it's weird, you say. Don't worry. You don't have to tell them. Actually, I would prefer that you don't tell anyone. Please. And should anyone question me, I'm not bad at impressions. I'll get really good at a you impression, it'll be the first thing I do. I know this all sounds very strange and potentially unpleasant, but remember the financial compensation that may or may not be happening. Hell, I'll even do some of your chores if you like, while you sleep. You can wake up and the dishes will be done, laundry folded and coffee made. Doesn't that sound nice? And then you open the fridge and oh, what's this? Someone baked banana bread last night. That was me, I baked banana bread last night. Now I should say, I don't have a lot of standards, I really don't. But I do, unfortunately, have some, so let's just get them out of the way, before I waste your time. Please do not contact me, if you have any of the following. Okay. Sorry, it's just not going to work out. I can pay for iron supplements, but I can't work miracles. A weak immune system. I don't like getting sick, I'm sorry. It's gross, sick people are gross. I mean, I know it's not your fault, but healthy folks only, please. A strong immune system. Yes, I know what I just said, but I also don't want to be attacked by your immune system. So maybe you're not the picture of health, but you're just kind of okay. I'm looking for someone who is just kind of okay. A penchant for alcohol, it makes me feel strange. A name that starts with a P, I'm not the greatest at speaking. It's hard, moving air through your throat and moving your tongue, and your mouth at the same time. You all do it so easy, can't say I'm not envious. I'm the worst at making the P sound. I intentionally avoid any P word in conversation, and get by well enough, but I look pretty foolish, if I'm cavorting about, pretending to be you, and I can't even say your own name. Those are my standards, but really, other than that, I'll take anyone. I don't care if you're male or female or whatever. I don't care if you're gay. I don't care if you're smart. I don't care if you don't have a lawyer. There are so many things that I don't care about. Now, I've specified all the ways in which I could compensate you, and how our relationship will be not in any way problematic, but I want to stress that, above all things, I am looking for a friend. Someone I can spend quiet evenings with. If you want to hang out with me during the day, that's great. I can give you fun hallucinations. Or you could have hallucinations the normal way, like by reading, like what you're doing now. I love to read. I love doing funny voices. I wonder what you think I sound like. I hope I sound nice. And one of the best things about me is I'm very quiet. No one else will be able to hear me except you. I'll be like your own personal friend that only you know. Like a secret friend. And you don't even have to talk to me, because I can read your thoughts. I suppose I should tell you a bit more about myself, since you're still reading. I was born in the Everglades, I think. It's been a while. But I remember being so cold, and so alone, but then I met this sweaty man in a colorful t-shirt, with a camera, and half a granola bar, and with blood so hot. So yeah, he was my first host, and I'll admit, we weren't the best of friends. It was a confusing time for both of us. I was confused. He was confused. What happened was really both of our faults, you could say. He was a bird watcher, if I recall correctly. Just watched birds all the time. I thought it might have been out of jealousy. Watching those little things flying around makes you feel kind of stuck. I felt stuck. So I decided to be a bird for a while to see if it was really all it's cracked up to be. Squished myself into the body of this lovely American crow. We settled down, built a nest, and laid several nice, healthy eggs with a man bird by the name of Richard Baxter. He was a very proud bird, very large. And he gave me so many wonderful gifts. Like children, and also small pieces of plastic. I still have all of them. The plastic, not the children. I'd never been so happy. All these hormones had me consumed in the joy of motherhood, but the crow's health was failing. I could not sustain myself. Its pathetic little heart beat weaker and weaker. I tried starving, I tried everything I could. I wanted to be a bird so bad. But it just wasn't working out. The birds stopped working. The other crows held a funeral service for me, even though I was still alive. I tried to tell them, but I'm not good at speaking, you remember. It was all just a big mess. I haven't seen Baxter since, but I still think about him a lot. Is that weird? I'm totally over it though. After that incident, I got kind of depressed, but I was too much of a coward to do much about it. I possessed a lot of trash animals, gulls, raccoons, and salespeople. I did what I could to survive. That's kind of where I am now. I am currently living in Miami, Florida. Been body surfing almost every day, haha. Right now I'm using a library computer and a librarian. She does not like being possessed. Boy howdy are these fingers twitching. But you can thank her for my halfway decent grammar. I'm tired of feeling like a parasite. I want to try a different approach. I want to be friends. Like with Richard Baxter, except I also live in your brain and drink your blood sometimes. But I'll make you bread in your sleep, so it's okay. It's been really hard finding someone willing to put up with me. I've tried everything. So I thought I would put up an advertisement online. Why not? Can't say the P word in real life, but you can hear it in your head loud enough, I hope. I know I kept saying that I would compensate you financially, but I'm going to be real with you. I don't have much. I've got like $20, some small pieces of plastic and a book about finance. But I'm a real hoot. So please, if you are interested, leave your comments below. I would love to get to know you. I need to go now. The library is closing soon, but I'll get back as soon as I can.
Few days later.
Just borrowed someone's mobile device and also fingers, so I can now respond. My name is James now. I was a fool to think that this job was just a job. Everything from the advertisement to going and actually applying was way too trivial and inviting. I'm trying to tell myself that I'm going to be okay, but I just don't know. I have some time before it happens, so I'll try to explain how fucked I am. In light of the pandemic that's been around for more than a year at this point, I was extremely tight on money. Having moved out of my parents' house right before Corona started shutting down businesses and any possible sources of income for me was bad enough, but being a college student on top of that was absolutely not helping my case. For the longest time, after leaving California, I lived in one of those $15 a night, ran down motels while attending ASU, and life was undeniably a struggle. Cheap housing was fine. I could tolerate the dank and stained mattresses provided in the rooms. Granted, I had been smart enough to take some washable sheets and comforters, as well as Febres from home. I probably washed those daily cause of how hot it'd get in those old, barely ventilated rooms. The real problem came from the crime. In the city of Tempe, Arizona, there were almost 1,000 cases of burglary in the year 2019 alone. Now, granted at that time, The stat didn't scare me because I thought I'd be living in the dorms on campus. So, me as a high school senior thought nothing of it. But here I am. 4 nights before I ended up in my current situation, there was a case of breaking and entering reported from the floor under mine. Someone was apparently abducted and had literally everything taken. The only items that remained were their toothbrush, still neatly placed by the sink of the small bathroom attached to the main room, and the key to the room, which had the name of the person staying there scribbled onto the paper tab. Even their bed sheets were taken, strangely enough. Maybe criminals need hostages and clean bed sheets. Needless to say, that was enough motivation for me to start making some better financial decisions. I went 2 through 4 job interviews over the course of the next 3 days. I was turned down by all 4. They said I lacked intuition. Yesterday morning, however, I came across a neatly organized advertisement online from a company by the name of MORD. The bold font stood out from my computer screen, detailing, "No experience required, great pay, call for interview." From the other advertisements I was looking at, I chose to pursue this one. I felt almost as if it was calling to me. Or maybe it was beaconing my bank account. I called there and then, and after a few rings of the dial tone, the sound of a young woman came through. "Hello there, are you calling about the job advertisements we put out recently?" she asked gingerly. "Hey, yeah, actually, I am. I would like to schedule an interview for later today." I stumbled with my words. At times I find it hard to talk to people, and the quarantine was not helping me be any less socially awkward. "Is that alright?" I asked cautiously. "Oh, eager are we now? That's no problem. Can I have your name? It's for filing purposes," she responded, clicking keys on her keyboard. She responded quickly. It somehow made my brain tick, but I ignored it as best I could. "Yeah, it'll be Jason Brody." Fabulous. I could practically feel that woman smirking at me. The rest of the phone call was somewhat uneventful. I was told the job was hosted in a town somewhat far away from Tempe. For your own safety, I won't tell you which town. I was told I could show up to their facility around 8 p.m. This left me the rest of the day to contemplate my decision. I had somehow just then realized I didn't even ask what I would be doing at the job. I didn't ask for the girl's name either. Come to think of it, I have never heard of a company by the name of MORD, owning such a big plot of land out where they were located. What did MORD even stand for? At that point, I couldn't really care less. I had dollar signs waving in my face, so I hastily went for it. Too bad, so sad, I thought, as I went to prepare for later. I gathered the best clothes I could and took the evening bus to a stop relatively close to the property. Their facility was sizable, reminiscent of an office building, situated out away from everything. It was essentially a desert out here, even though the more urban areas were probably 45 minutes away. Still, there were some buildings scattered out along the road. MORD's, however, was strangely pronounced. Compared to the other dusty buildings, this one looked weirdly clean and pristine in the evening sun. As I got to the front entrance of the building, I was greeted with a reception area. The walls were painted in a bright and reflective shade of white, with black trim which met a marvelous red carpet with black and white patterns etched into it. It reminded me a casino show floor. In the mostly empty and spacious room were some white leather couches, some pillars spread equally across the expanse of the room, and some houseplants in the corners. A young, blonde girl worked the front desk. "Mr. Brody, I presume," called the girl. "Yeah, I'm here, you must be who I spoke with earlier," I responded, doing my best not to stutter. Although the girl's facial features were hidden by a blue surgical mask, she seemed pleasant. Her nameplate read on it. Not even a last name. "Alright, if walk down that hall over there, it'll be the first room to the right." She pointed her finger to a hallway to the right of me, Much thanks, I replied. By her voice, I assumed she was probably in her early 20s, probably working some lame job to gather money, similar to how I was. Inside of the room was a wooden desk and some chairs. The decorative pattern of the lobby also seemed to flow into office rooms as well. On the desk, laid a piece of paper and an envelope. Cautiously, I took up the paper. It read, MORD insert address here. Room 2. Good evening, Jason. It is truly unfortunate that I couldn't see you in person before you start. As you should know by now, you will be working overnight in our facility as an overnight guard. As mentioned in the advertisement, the pay should be satisfactory. You will receive $1,500 US per working night. Your uniform can be found on the chair behind you, in the corner. You will find your post for tonight using the map of the building provided on the back of this page. Be at your post by 11:30 p.m. tonight. You may spend the time leading up to your shift in any way you'd like. Do not go down the stairs, said Aaron. I laughed at the last comment. Way to be ominous, I thought. It was about 8 p.m. then, so I decided to get some rest in before my shift. I slept in the chair, where I had originally picked up my uniform. The pay was enough to cover my tuition in a matter of weeks. No way I was turning back. My alarm rang at 11:20 p.m. I shot up, put on my uniform, and followed the detailed fire escape route map of the building to my post. Aaron had kindly used a red marker to guide me through the hallways. I arrived at my post by 11:26 p.m. Just enough time for me to take a quick glance at the rules. I figured that since I'd been hired on the spot, I was in no rush to fret over these. The paper contained a list of 14 rules. The first rules were modest. Rule 1. From a time period of 11:30 p.m. to the end of your shift at 6 a.m., you must walk the ground floor's perimeter twice. You may choose the intervals at which these patrols happen. Easy. Rule 2. From a time period of 2 a.m. to 3:33 a.m. you must take a patrol of the second floor. Walking the perimeter suffices as a patrol. Oddly specific. Rule 3. You will also be tasked with observing the CCTV cameras stationed around the building. If you observe anything you would consider abnormal, please use the phone in your room to contact the front desk. They will know what to do. Connection number 999. I sighed. It's whatever I thought. Must be some new guy hazing ritual. Reminds me of when my old burger joint used to decorate for Halloween. Oddly spooky. I laughed internally. Maybe they're just reusing some old supplies from Halloween. It's March though. I shrugged it off. Taking a look at my watch, it was now 11:30. I was officially on the clock. Looking up, I observed the room I had been stationed in. In contrast with other rooms on the first floor, the red carpet that had been present throughout the greater part of the building did not go past the doorframe. Rather, this room had a bleak gray carpet, the color reminiscent of wet concrete. The walls of this room were faded white. Numerous maroon stains laid in contrast from the color of the wall. Some long stains even followed onto the ceiling. Exactly across from the metal door was an industrial metal table. On the table sat 12 monitors, stacked 4x3. Next to the pile, laid a beige office phone. In the corner of the room to my right were 4 blue lockers. In the other corner of the room there was a small yellow bin, with something black inside of it. Classy. Flipping around, I decided to go out for my first patrol right off the bat. I took the envelope with the rules and kept reading. Rule 4. For your own safety, before exiting your room for a patrol, look through all of the camera feeds. Then refer to Rule 3. Well shit. I found it almost comical that this company was talking about my safety. After all, aren't I supposed to be the most dangerous thing in the building? I'm pretty sure I saw a baton in the bin. I didn't grab it though. I found it funny how I kept messing up. Legitimately comical. Rule 5. While on patrol, you might encounter rooms where the doors are open and people are seemingly moving inside, but the lights inside the room are turned off. Do not enter these rooms. Do not shine your flashlight in these rooms. They don't like light. I stopped dead in my tracks, almost falling over with how hard I planted my feet into the ground. I read the rule over 2 more times, thinking I has misinterpreted it, or something. I started to feel the creeping sensation of fear enter my body. Logically, this had to be a prank. Had to. I had too many thoughts to portray onto this note, but I kept reading. Rule 6. If you are on patrol, and you encounter one of these rooms, and something seems to be exiting the room, do not look at it. If you must, stare at the ground and walk backwards until you can turn around, and get back to your room quickly. Refer to Rule 3, before finishing that round of patrol. Rule 7. If you are in your room and you hear scratching at your door, almost as if a pet were beckoning to be let in, do not open the door. If the scratches intensify, you must ignore them. Do not attempt to look out the small window in the door. It is best if you keep your back to the door. Rule 8. If you notice that one of the cameras in your room has gone black or has started to show static, you must take the baton that was provided to you and smash the screen of the monitor. It can get in, otherwise. Try to smash only the screen. The top of the monitor frame is labeled accordingly to where the camera was displaying. You must avoid that area whenever patrolling. Rule 9. If you sense something is following you, run into your room. Chances are it can't get past the door. Rule 10. If something manages to break into your room, remain completely and utterly still wherever you are and drop whatever you are doing. Do not open your eyes. It will try to coerce you. Rule 11. At no point before 6 a.m. should you consider leaving the premises of the building. You are locked in for your safety. I sharply inhaled upon the realization that I was locked in. This was undeniably the fastest my heart has ever beat. I was practically gauging on my own tongue. I wanted to say something to calm myself down, but couldn't find words. I managed to get a hold of myself soon after, until the ground floor's lights shut off. I was surrounded by darkness. I stumbled backwards a few steps to find the wall of the hallway. I was utterly blinded by the darkness. I fumbled with the utility belt of my uniform, trying to find which small pocket housed a flashlight. I got a hold of it after a moment, switched it on, and all I could think to do was look around me. Wide-eyed, I turned several 360s before considering taking a step forward to trudge onward. The lights must be on a timer, I thought. Shining my light onto my black analog watch, the time read 11:40 p.m. This is absolutely terrible. As subtle as a mouse, I creeped onward. In a foot race, an ant probably could have beat me to the end of the hallway. I hadn't realized it before, but this building was quite expansive. In each hallway, there seemed to be doorways to at least 25 rooms total, and the hallways were probably each 150 feet long. The building was laid out like a grid, with hallways connecting at certain intervals every now and again, making it easy to navigate, since there were all right angles. Having not encountered anything for the first 10 minutes of creeping, I quickened my pace to a slow walk. Surprisingly, I made a complete perimeter of the ground floor in about 45 minutes, while not having seen anything. Perhaps it's because I didn't dare to make a sound, or look at anything but the hallway in front of me, but I made it back to my room safe. I peered around the room, nothing seemed to be hiding inside. Stepping in, I closed the door behind me. My watch read 12:44 a.m. Suddenly, the office phone on the table blared its ringtone. Almost stumbling over from a heart attack, I inched closer to the phone. I put my hand on the handle and held the speaker to my ear. The voice of a man came through. "Hello, how are you?" asked the man in deep and slow voice. It's good, who are you?" Ignoring my question, The man continued, "What do you believe in?" Static from the phone erupted briefly. "Wait, what do you mean?" I was sufficiently flustered, like religion. "I'm atheist." There was a brief pause. "What is your name?" asked the man. He sounded cold and lifeless now. There was no inflection left in his voice. His breaths were shallow, like his diaphragm could no longer push enough air out of his mouth. "Jason." The man's voice became distorted past what I could ever possibly try to describe. It was similar to someone choking or gargling on some thick liquid. It hurt my heart to hear somehow, but it was talking to me through the distortion. I didn't know what it was saying. The phone line cut. It was eerily silent around me now. And then it dinged on me. I whipped the envelope out and scanned the rules for anything mentioning a phone. I read. Rule 13. If the phone in your station begins to ring, you must answer it. Answer any questions it may ask. If it hangs up before you do, resume duties. If it asks for your name, do not answer. Hang up and resume duties. My heart dropped. I really had nothing running through my head right at that moment, other than dread. From the silence, came a knock at the room's door. I flipped around instantly to face it. Before taking a step forward, I looked at the paper with rules again. Rule 14. If there is knocking coming from the door to your room, it is most likely the result of not following one of the previously mentioned rules. Refer to Rule 7. If the handle to the door begins to jingle, refer to Rule 10. I looked up to the door. The handle to the door had silently been turning, and I had not noticed. I gasped and dropped the envelope somewhere on the ground from surprise. I instantly shut my eyes and crouched down, trying to find it by feeling the ground. I heard the door start to creak open, its metal hinges squeaking. Planting both hands on the carpet, I prepared for what was about to unfold. What I felt at first was a strange awe. It became seemingly colder inside of the room, but my body remained warm. Strange sensations coated my arms and legs, the kind where it tingles, and you'd expect to find a spider crawling on you, but there's nothing there. My head felt unfathomably hot compared to the other parts of my body. That's when it spoke. Its voice was reminiscent to that of the thing that spoke to me on the phone, however it was not gargling. It had the same vocal tone as the thing on the phone, but this time it spoke with inflection and an accent. It sounded human. "Hey, it's okay, open your eyes and come with me." It repeated that phrase several times, and then, almost as if it were perplexed by why I wasn't responding, it started speaking again. This time in German. "Komm schon, Freund. Es geht nix zu befürchten. Lass uns gehen. Bitte offen deine Augen da." And then in what I assumed to be Russian. And then in an Asian language I did not recognize. And then it went silent, but the feeling in my body was still present, along with the intense cramping of my muscles. I did not dare open my eyes. I remained in my crouched position for seemed like an eternity. When the sensations in my body subsided, I finally mustered up the courage to open my eyes. There was no monster, from anything I could see. The door remained wide open. The light that illuminated my small room of salvation spilled into the hallway outside. I shut up and closed the door as quickly and quietly as I could, somehow thinking that it might still be outside somewhere. I don't remember exactly how I felt, but deprived of oxygen from forgetting to breathe is somewhat accurate. I was sweating profusely and trying to get a hold of my breath. My watch read 1:02 a.m. Spotting the envelope on the ground, I bent over and went to review the rules. Glancing over the ones I've already read, I recalled the cameras. Looking to the table, I began to switch on the monitors one by one, with a small on-off button next to the label of where the camera was shooting. All camera feeds displayed seemingly still images of the long dark hallways, except for one, which displayed one room in a hallway with the lights on inside. I figured this must have been the camera shooting footage of my hallway, and that illuminated room was the one I was in. The label on the monitor read Hallway 4. Correlating that to the map Aaron had given me, it seems I was mistaken. I was located in Hallway 3. Seeming as none of the rules I had read so far mentioned the lights being on, I looked down to the phone to call the front desk. Before picking up the receiver, I hesitated, almost as if the monster from earlier would start asking questions again. But I dialed 9 3 times and the dial tone began to sound. After 3 tones, the voice of a young man came through. "Hello, front desk representative speaking." He spoke with a distinct southern accent. "Hey, there's well, in hallway number 4, there's a room with a light on." I responded, trying to keep it together. Almost snottily, the man retorted, "Is that truly abnormal? There are consequences for calling this line without a reason." I did not enjoy his tone. "You listen to me, I have seen my fair share of fucking abnormal tonight. Don't you try to tell me." He gave in after my one-sentence verbal assault. "We'll send someone over." However, I don't think that southern ass ever sent anyone. I never saw anyone walk through that hallway for the next 20 minutes. I guess I'll figure it out myself, I thought. Before I left the room, I remembered to grab the baton that sat in the bin in the corner of the room. Opening the door, I peered out, looking left and right as if I were crossing a street, and I headed over to hallway 4. Nothing seemed to be out of place, though. No doors were open, and all the lights remained off. I guess I've made it this far, might as well do my second patrol. Through the rest of my patrol, I encountered 2 of the rooms described by Rule 5. I heeded the warning of the rule, and simply walked past the room without investigating inside. Those rooms were truly strange though. Walking past the room, it sounded similar to the inside of a populated Muller train station, where there was a lot of bustling. I took a quick glance inside one of these rooms as I passed it in the hallway. Through the darkness I could see movement, but I could not relate it to anything I could comprehend. It had the form of a black mass, swirling around. Moving on, I walked down a flight of stairs, figuring I'd do an extra good job, and continue onward. Everything seemed darker down there, but it was reminiscent of a copy of the ground floor from what I could remember. My feet made a small squishing sound while walking. The floor seemed to be slightly flooded by a thin layer of water. I felt like I had bad night blindness down there. My flashlight seemed to losing power as well, or something to that extent, because the beam dimmed the further I walked. It smelled old rotting wood and rusty metal. It was also quite humid, like an indoor swimming pool. I felt some of the water from the ground soak my running shoes. My hands were starting to get clammy, and the air seemed to get heavier with each step, compressing my chest, making it hard to breathe. I looked at my watch. It seemed to have stopped working as well. The time remained frozen at 1:07 a.m., but I knew it was way later than that though. I stopped where I was, and leaned against one of the hallway's walls. Pulling out the envelope, I gazed upon the rules. Rule 12 was quite vague. Rule 12, you are always being deceived. Remember. This left me quite confused. I flipped over the rules paper. Written in a pronounced bold font sat Rule 15. Rule 15, do not go down the stairs. A basement floor does not exist on this building. Upon descending the stairs, your safety cannot be guaranteed. In fact, our company does not know exactly what happens upon descending the stairs. We only know the result. Thus, we do not yet understand how to effectively combat this. You have a limited amount of time to pray to your deity of choice, because you have just entered a portal to the 4th circle of hell. MORD. I felt my legs give out a little. I looked into the darkness ahead of me, behind me and all around me. I yelled from fear, and backtracked as fast I could. I jumped up 3 stairs at a time, and hauled absolute ass back to my room. I ripped the lockers in the corner of the room from the wall, and barricaded the door. I already tried redialing the phone. No one picked up. I don't know what's approaching me, but I can feel it. It's different than the creature which knocked on the door. My body is in pain, aching, and writhing, burning. I can sense it, and it can sense me. It's coming to take me. I can see it in my head, dark and disfigured, eyeless, pale, soulless and satanic. I am scared. I don't know what to do. I don't understand why I'm here. I don't understand why this is happening to me. Please, whoever may be reading my warning, if you ever agree to a job that seems too good to be true, it is.